Hey everyone, welcome back. Chapters 841 through 850 of the previous episode. Qian Ping'an traveled through malicious Ghost Valley, outsmarting a cunning scholar and capturing him. He avoided clashes with powerful entities like Gao Chang, accumulated treasures, and returned safely to the Flax Robe sect. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 851. Zhu Quan started to drink, but most likely feeling like she was being slightly unreasonable for asking Qian Ping'an for more wine, she also started to drink sparingly and in small sips. Sure enough, it was City Lord Gao Chang of Skeleton Wall City, the most powerful heroic spirit in malicious Ghost Valley. When deciding to flee from malicious Ghost Valley before, Qian Ping'an had also had some speculations in his mind. He had carefully filtered through all of the nascent tier ghost entities recorded in the Be at Ease compilation, and he had naturally considered Skeleton Wall City's Gao Chang as well. However, he had felt like the possibility was slim. This was because the higher one's cultivation base, the loftier one's gaze. This was the case for White Cage City's Pu Rang, and it was also the case for the two mighty beings from the Great Round Moon Monastery and the small mystery capital temple in the Peachtree Forest. When standing on the bank of the Black River, Qian Ping'an's remark of one needs to have the proper mindset to achieve proper results had actually encapsulated a very large group of people. Of course, this was excluding vagrant cultivators. There were also many unexpected surprises in the world, and there wasn't anything that was absolutely certain. As such, even though Qian Ping'an had felt like it was least likely for Skeleton Wall City's Gao Chang to be the culprit when Yang Ningxing had mentioned a so-called watchful gaze from the north, he was coincidentally someone who was accustomed to preparing for the worst. As such, he had directly viewed Gao Chang as his hypothetical enemy. Otherwise, Qian Ping'an had already been staying at Green Cottage Town, very close to where sect leader Zhu Quan had been cultivating in her thatched cottage. So had there been any need for him to use 2 gold paper land-shortening talismans and split apart the barrier in the sky to leave malicious Ghost Valley? Moreover, he had already been sure that there were spies of Skeleton Wall City hiding in Green Cottage Town beforehand, and he had purposely taken one extra trip to Copper Stench City. In reality, Qian Ping'an's escape plan had been silently set into motion the moment that he had tossed the lesser heat coin to the ghost captain at the city gate of Copper Stench City. Qian Ping'an had, in fact, already figured out a rough vein linking everything together in the depths of his mind. For more chapters, visit n0v.fire.net. There were many critical points along this vein, for example, Yang Ningxing voicing his feelings near the suspension bridge between the two cliffs. On the bank of the Black River, the old monk had gazed at the opposite shore and chanted Ba, before silently saying that there was salvation in repentance, a seemingly offhand remark. After entering Green Cottage Town, theoretically the safest place in malicious Ghost Valley, Qian Ping'an had surprisingly been unable to lower his calligraphy brush and draw talismans. At the same time, he had even failed to calm his mind when trying to perform standing meditation. This was extremely rare. Looking even further back, there was the fated opportunity pertaining to the female heavenly official from Mural City. The Deer Rider Divine Maiden had walked out from her mural and made her way to the dock at the Swaying River, transforming into an old lady to feel out Qian Ping'an. Mural City was the first place that Qian Ping'an had stayed at after arriving at the northern complete reed continent. Yang Ningxing had refined and condensed his evil thoughts into a small speck, and the scholar had once spoken casually at the water goddess shrine near the Black River, and inadvertently said that he hadn't won a single time against Qian Ping'an. When it came to worldly matters, fortune and misfortune always came hand in hand. Qian Ping'an had a very deep understanding of this. If one indulged in fortune for a long time, what would the outcome be? Even though Qian Ping'an had already fled far away from malicious Ghost Valley and arrived at the Flax Robe Sect's Wood Garment Mountain, he still felt a lingering sense of fear in his mind. He had enjoyed a very successful run as a wandering merchant at Copper Stench City, so under normal circumstances, he should have naturally continued to travel north in malicious Ghost Valley. This was especially the case since he had faced no genuine danger the entire time, and he had instead made a small profit everywhere he went. Qian Ping'an hadn't necessarily enjoyed exceptional fortune, but he had enjoyed continuous fortune that had allowed him to make some money here and there. Moreover, the deer rider divine maiden ultimately had nothing to do with him, and the same could be said for the small thunder pool at Accumulating Cloud Mountain and the fated opportunity at Treasure Mirror Mountain. It was as if Chen Ping'an had relied on his own cautiousness and a smidgen of fortune to obtain the small profits. This was seemingly the type of situation that would make Chen Ping'an feel the safest and most relaxed. Chen Ping'an squinted his eyes and downed the remaining rice wine in a single gulp. Zhu Quan glanced at the sword on Chen Ping'an's back and lightly shook her head, thinking that it most likely wasn't this item that Gao Cheng was after. Even though the city lord of Skeleton Wall City was the arch-enemy of the entire Flax Robe sect, the past leaders of the sect had all acknowledged that this heroic spirit of malicious Ghost Valley was indeed a mighty figure among ghosts. He possessed an impressive cultivation base and an equally impressive breadth of mind. As such, Gao Cheng wouldn't stoop as low as to covet the weapon of Chen Ping'an even if it truly was a pseudo-celestial tool. He most definitely wouldn't become so apoplectic with rage either. In a rare turn of events, Zhu Quan actually thought for a moment before speaking, and after finding the right words she said, "I won't ask about how you attracted Gao Cheng's attention, and you don't need to voluntarily tell me either. This is something between you and him. Of course, fighting against Gao Cheng and Skeleton Wall City has always been the responsibility of cultivators from the Flax Robe sect, and we won't complain about this even if we get injured or die. You don't need to feel obliged to get involved in the future simply because you sought shelter at Wood Garment Mountain after fleeing from malicious Ghost Valley. There's no need to repay us for this help. There's no need for us to be so polite with each other either." "All right," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. Zhu Quan chuckled and remarked, "Good one, you truly aren't being polite anymore." At the small mystery capital temple located in the peach tree forest of malicious Ghost Valley, the old Taoist priest stood under the towering peach tree, with mist permeating around his feet like a gigantic painting of mountains and rivers that was slowly rolling open. When a scholar appeared in the painting and entered Copper Stench City to participate in that childish so-called imperial examination, the heart of Su Song, the young Taoist priest holding a horsetail whisk, jolted, and he asked in a quivering voice, "Master, is this one of those rumored fleeting glance picture scrolls?" The old Taoist priest nodded and replied, "The branch master from the lofty cloud palace of the Great Origin Empire's esteemed mystery department personally wrote a letter and sent it to the small mystery capital temple, asking me to act as the temporary Tao guardian of Yang Ningxing. Since I decided to help, I thought that I might as well help to the best of my ability, so I made this painting as a means to achieve this aim. However, you can rest assured that this is only a copy of the genuine fleeting glance picture scrolls, so the price to pay won't be very high. Outsiders can only observe things 3 times, and the reason that I'm letting you observe it once is because I want you to observe Tao as you watch these events unfold. This is called borrowing stones from another mountain to polish jade. So make sure to watch carefully." Su Song was astounded and he exclaimed, "Yang Ningxing, that young heavenly lord from the esteemed mystery department, only came to malicious Ghost Valley to sightsee, and it was actually his older brother who was obtaining the treasure at Treasure Mirror Mountain. That being the case, was there any need to take things so far?" The old Taoist priest smiled and replied, "I was also puzzled in the beginning, and I could only guess that these matters very likely pertain to battles of the Great Tao. In any case, everything will make sense once you finish watching the events play out on this picture scroll." Su Song widened his eyes, not willing to let slip a single detail on the picture scroll. However, Yang Ningxing's actions at Copper Stench City were truly unsightly, and Su Song would have felt like his master was making a big fuss over a small issue if it weren't for the fact that he had gone as far as to use a fleeting glance picture scroll. He would have also felt like the branch master of the lofty cloud palace was getting overly worried for nothing. However, Su Song immediately pushed aside these thoughts when he saw the so-called scholar reduce Peeling Mountain's Lady Bishu to nothing but black smoke. Meanwhile, the young swordsman was squatting on the wall and watching on as this happened. Su Song's expression became slightly serious. Many more things happened afterward. Su Song was terrified by what he saw, with his mind fluctuating greatly as he watched. When the scenes on the fleeting glance picture scroll finally came to a stop, the picture scroll transformed into an ordinary one that was gently picked up by his master. "What are your thoughts?" the old Taoist priest asked with a smile. There was an ashamed expression on Su Song's face as he replied, "If I were Brother Howren, then I would have died by Yang Ningxing's hands countless times." The old Taoist priest nodded and added, "And if you were him, you most definitely wouldn't have been able to escape from malicious Ghost Valley." Su Song recalled the commotion at Green Cottage Town a few days ago as well as the legitimate battle between immortals immediately afterward, and this caused the young Taoist priest to feel slightly deflated and dispirited. The old Taoist priest looked at his prized disciple and said with a faint smile, "What's wrong? You feel like you're inferior to someone else because of this? If that's the case, then will you smash your head against a tree to commit suicide if I tell you that the true age of that young wanderer from the outside world is only a sliver over 20? Beads of sweat formed on Su Song's forehead. The old Taoist priest sighed and shook his head, continuing, "Naive child, is it truly a good thing to always walk the tightrope between life and death and fortune and calamity to fight for that 1 in 10,000 chance? To cultivators, just how terrifying is it to become mired down in the mortal world, and to be entangled by the tendrils of karmic fate? Taking a step back, even if you're genuinely inferior to that person right now, is that any reason for you to stop cultivating and stop comprehending Tao? Translating this to me, your master, should I feel deflated and dispirited every time I think about the lofty Tao ancestor, the 3-branch masters slightly below him, or the transcendent immortals at White Jade Capital another step below? Should I tell myself that I'll give up and just let things be?" Su Song looked up with a dazed expression. The old Taoist priest lightly flicked Su Song's head and explained, "Taoists like us cultivate ourselves, and our greatest enemy is the withering of nature and the restrictive confines of life and death. Our enemy isn't some other person. Do the glory and fall of other people have anything to do with us? In my view, perhaps there's no need to even fight for the genuine great Tao. However, forget about it. Saying too much will be counterproductive." Su Song took a step back and bowed in respect, saying, "Thank you, Master, I understand things a bit better now." "Then that's sufficient," the old Taoist priest said with a satisfied nod. Each mural was originally a door to an immortal mystical realm. Following the 8 murals transforming into white sketches, however, the immortal abode lost more than half of its spiritual energy, transforming into ordinary immortal abodes which were superior to blessed lands but inferior to small worlds. It was still a treasured land with good feng shui, but there was no longer anything astonishing about it. Jiang Shangzhen was very disappointed as he walked through the mystical realm again. After using his bonded item, a willow leaf, to slash open the barrier in the sky and return to Skeleton Shoal, Jiang Shangzhen didn't immediately leave the northern complete reed continent, and he instead secretly came to this mystical realm. There were some things that would leave an itch in his heart if he didn't figure them out properly. Moreover, hiding in this mystical realm was killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Firstly, hiding here was safer than hiding at Wood Garment Mountain. Secondly, he was worried that the after effects would be relatively terrifying after he formed a bad relationship with He Xiaoyang. That ruthless woman was someone who enjoyed incredible fortune, so once she developed resentment toward Jiang Shangzhen, it was extremely likely that he would mysteriously suffer misfortune if he remained in ordinary areas of the northern complete reed continent. He wouldn't suffer great calamities per se, but he would definitely suffer enough misfortunes to feel completely disgusted. For example, Jiang Shangzhen was incredibly worried that he would encounter that old woman who was traveling around the south if he showed his face at Skeleton Shoal or Wood Garment Mountain. Afterward, she would have tears and snot streaming down her face as she tearfully complained to Jiang Shangzhen. He genuinely couldn't stand these kinds of reunions. However, thinking as he lay in the field of flowers in this mystical realm, thinking as he sat in the bed with brocade blankets, thinking as he lay on the makeup table with lingering fragrance, and as he sat on the railing of the tall building that celestial maidens had definitely leaned on before, Jiang Shangzhen was ultimately unable to fully comprehend some matters. It was as if 3 days had flashed past in the blink of an eye. He would ask if he couldn't figure these things out by himself. Jiang Shangzhen controlled his bonded item, and had it knock loudly on one of the doors of the mystical realm. It wasn't long before a familiar face arrived. However, the old ancestor of the Flax Robe sect was infuriated when he saw Jiang Shangzhen, and he bellowed in anger. "You're still not going to fuck off, Jiang Shangzhen? The Flax Robe sect doesn't have any more dog shit to feed you." Jiang Shangzhen sat on a railing and peered down at the short-tempered old man, saying with a cheerful grin, "Don't mind me, and please speak in a more civilized manner. I'm now an ally of the Flax Robe sect, after all." The old ancestor of the flax robe sect didn't speak any nonsense, and he was just about to resort to violence. Zhang Shangzhen hurriedly raised his hands and said in a serious voice, "I have proper matters to discuss with sect leader Zhu Quan, and I naturally have matters to discuss with your guest at Wood Garment Mountain as well. It's best that you ask them to come over here to chat with me." The old ancestor had already retrieved his bonded item, and by the looks of it, he wasn't simply stretching his body to loosen up. Zhang Shangzhen lightly patted the railing with his hands and sighed in exasperation. "This place is a precious base for your flax robe sect, so will you guys not be the ones to suffer if you always fight here and destroy the surroundings?" The old ancestor chuckled coldly, and 4 heavenly king statues had already appeared around him after he retrieved his bonded wooden tablet. The limbs of the heavenly king statues moved slowly as golden light continued to gather in their eyes. This was what Zhang Shangzhen was afraid of when it came to cultivators from the northern complete reed continent. They all liked to fight first before discussing matters later. If this were the past, Zhang Shangzhen would have happily entertained his opponent and given them a fight. He had only been at the Golden Courtier back then, but he had dared to call himself the #1 troublemaker and the best at fighting and cursing. If things went south, then he would be the most capable at fleeing. Indeed, he regarded himself as a leader in these 3 fields. However, Zhang Shangzhen wasn't planning to return to the cultivation world during this trip to the northern complete reed continent. Zhang Shangzhen glanced up and breathed a sigh of relief. Sect leader Zhu Quan's embroidered shoe once again appeared amid the sea of clouds in the sky, and it was as large as a mountain to begin with, blotting out heaven and earth. However, Zhu Quan immediately shrank down to a normal size by the time she arrived on the ground. Standing beside Zhu Quan was Chen Pingyan. The 2 of them appeared in the corridor on the top level of the towering pagoda. Zhu Quan told the old ancestor to return to Wood Garment Mountain first. The old ancestor cursed as he put away his bonded wooden tablet and retracted the 4 heavenly king statues. Zhang Shangzhen roared with laughter and jumped off the railing, saying, "Little Quaner, it's said that absence makes the heart grow fonder, with 1 day apart feeling like 3 years separated. In this sense, we've essentially been apart for 10 years already, so do you miss me a lot? I know that you definitely don't miss me at all, am I right?" Zhu Quan couldn't be bothered to even take a glance at him, and she said to Chen Pingyan, "Rest assured, I'll immediately make my way over if you face any trouble. I'm more motivated to kill this pervert than I am to flatten Skeleton Wall City." Zhang Shangzhen paid no heed to this, and he leaned against the railing and used his hand as a fan, lightly flapping it back and forth as he said with a wide grin, "Little Quaner is just as lively and adorable as in the past." Zhu Quan disappeared with a flash, returning to Wood Garment Mountain through the sea of clouds. Once sect leader Zhu Quan and the old ancestor of the flax robe sect left, Zhang Shangzhen flicked his large sleeve and retrieved numerous strange and wonderful immortal treasures, surprisingly sealing the gate amid the sea of clouds that linked this mystical realm to Wood Garment Mountain. At the same time, he also sealed the 8 small gates linked to the murals of the female heavenly officials. After he did this, Zhu Quan's muffled voice immediately traveled over from outside, cursing, "Do you want to eat my saber strikes, Zhang Shangzhen?" The sea of clouds then started to tremor violently, with Zhu Quan presumably starting to attack the gate at Wood Garment Mountain. Zhang Shangzhen flicked his sleeve again, causing an endless stream of dazzling immortal treasures to fly out and comprehensively block the gate in the sea of clouds. He then promised loudly, "If I commit a violent crime in here, then I'll allow you to beat me to death once I leave. What do you say?" Chen Pingyan was unfazed, and he took out a pot of wine and tossed another pot to Zhang Shangzhen, saying, "Thanks." The casual expression disappeared from Zhang Shangzhen's face, and he sighed with emotion and asked, "I'm very curious. Have you managed to guess who the person targeting you is? Isn't it Gao Cheng?" Chen Pingyan replied with a chuckle. Zhang Shangzhen didn't joke around in a rare display, and he simply fixed his gaze on Chen Pingyan. Chen Pingyan nimbly hopped up and sat on the railing, and Zhang Shangzhen did the same and sat next to him. The 2 of them then started to drink wine. "Your question has allowed me to confirm my suspicions," Chen Pingyan said. Zhang Shangzhen had a puzzled expression as he replied, "Then that makes me even more confused. I've investigated your past through all kinds of methods, and theoretically speaking, there shouldn't be such a deep connection between you and her." Chen Pingyan answered with something off-topic first, saying, Sect leader Zhu told me before about a remark from White Cage City's Pu Rang after he attacked Gao Cheng with his sword a few days ago. He said that the actions of sword cultivators have always been unrestrained by heaven and earth. This is truly a brilliant remark. Jiang Shangzhen took a large swig of wine, with his cheeks gurgling and vibrating slightly as if he were gargling the wine. He then threw his head back and downed the wine in a single gulp. After doing this, Jiang Shangzhen immediately leaned back and took another swig of wine, once again in no hurry to swallow the contents in his mouth. He had only lost a crappy net worth 70 to 80 grain rain coins in malicious Ghost Valley, yet he had been afforded the opportunity to watch this good show from the beginning to the end. This was a very good deal. After all, would it make any sense to discuss monetary matters with Jiang Shangzhen? To do so would be attempting to humiliate him, no? The reason that there exists an ambiguous connection between He Xiaoyang and me is because I was screwed over by that bastard Lu Chun, Chen Ping'an revealed slowly and expressionlessly. Jiang Shangzhen immediately spat out his mouthful of wine. Jiang Shangzhen hurriedly wiped his mouth with his hand and said with a pitiful expression, "Even though we're in the ruins of an immortal abode, directly calling out the name of a sage is still inappropriate." Chapter 499. 1. The source of living water flowing into the heart. Here are some grudges between us, so cursing him more or cursing him less won't change anything, Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. Chen Ping'an, answer me honestly this time, Jiang Shangzhen said. He then winked and raised his backside briefly, pointing to the sky and asking, "Is he hellbent on getting you killed?" Chen Ping'an shook his head and explained, "It's not that serious. The old grudges between us have mostly been dealt with already, and seeing that he's such a lofty branch master responsible for overseeing all of the living beings in a large world, he doesn't have so much spare time and effort to deal with me. However, I'm definitely an eyesore for him, so I'm feeling very hesitant about whether I should travel to the heavenly world in the future." In addition to the 9 continents of the majestic world, Chen Ping'an also wanted to visit the 3 large worlds beyond the majestic world. Only after hearing this did Jiang Shangzhen sit back down on the railing. Otherwise, if Lu Chun were hellbent on targeting Chen Ping'an, then he would obediently return to the eastern treasured vile continent's bamboo scroll lake to hide like a cowardly turtle. The lake was big and the water was deep, so if he didn't act like a turtle, would he perhaps act like a bird out of the forest? Old Man Sun had repeated the same phrase 10,000 times, saying that one needed to make haste and conform to the local customs and practices when one went to Bamboo Scroll Lake. One needed to view oneself as a powerful local force instead of a passing dragon. I know that you won't get yourself involved in some matters, so why don't you tell me what you can? Chen Ping'an asked. The source of this content is novelfire.net. Jiang Shangzhen took a small sip of wine before nodding and saying, Gao Cheng is incredibly ambitious, and his ambitions are so wild that he can scare some people to death. He wants to create a netherworld residence in malicious Ghost Valley that sits between the Yin world and the Yang world, a place where people can reincarnate as they live and die. There are 2 incredible benefits to achieving this, with one being the ability to turn around the feng shui of malicious Ghost Valley, and transforming this mystical realm into a realm similar to a complete blessed land. It will no longer be just a small world, and with heaven, earth, and humans existing in one place, the sun and the moon can genuinely be born along with the 4 seasons and the myriad sceneries of the solar terms. Gao Cheng will become the legitimate heaven of this place, and his status will be one step above that of the so-called sages who oversee the small worlds. He might even be able to ascend to lofty heights in a single step, directly advancing from the unpolished jade tier to the ascension tier, rapidly striding through the immortal tier in the process. At that time, Gao Cheng will be like that small number of strange beings in this world, genuinely achieving a state of great freedom, having broken through the restrictive cage of heaven and earth. Those who have the ability to kill him might not do so because they will have very likely cast their gaze much higher and much further. Meanwhile, those who genuinely want to kill Gao Cheng won't have the ability to do so. Another aspect is the effect on the conflicts and battles that take place afterward. Even if the Flax Robe sect is able to forcefully contain everything to just malicious Ghost Valley, Gao Cheng and Skeleton Wall City will still be enjoying a stable and indomitable position. In fact, each cultivator that the Flax Robe sect loses might be an extra bit of power that malicious Ghost Valley gains. If something untoward happens at the Ancestral Hall on Wood Garment Mountain, then the Flax Robe sect might accidentally allow Gao Cheng to charge to Skeleton Shoal with his army, bringing catastrophe to the empires and vassal states in the north along the swaying river. To say nothing of the Flax Robe sect that has fewer than 200 cultivators, even a coalition between the several sect-level immortal forces in the region won't be able to enjoy an advantage over Gao Chang at that time. Jiang Shangzhen held the neck of the wine pot between two fingers and gently swirled it around, continuing slowly. So Gao Chang's actions are a huge taboo. However, the fact that he was able to rise from an ordinary and nameless foot soldier to where he is today is a testament to his exceptional abilities. He's naturally no fool, and he's very calculated with everything that he does, taking things one step at a time. I suspect that he'll show extreme restraint in the next 100 years, immediately stopping his advance once he defeats the Flax Robe sect. Gao Chang will stop after he conquers the territory of Skeleton Shoal. In the following 1,000 years, he'll attack his neighbors and forge relationships with those further away, playing the different forces against each other, as he strives to conquer another sect-level immortal force. By progressing slowly, Skeleton Wall City will gradually become more and more legitimate in the eyes of other people. It's difficult to say how the Confucian academies will react, especially since they adhere to far too many rules. They often fight amongst themselves for a long time, and as things drag on, many conflicts and situations would have already reached a conclusion. Because of this, only two forces will genuinely resist Gao Chang at this current time. One is the Flax Robe sect, where everyone from the top to the bottom is simple-minded, and the other is the bald monks from the Buddhist sect. After all, the Buddhist sect is definitely unwilling to see someone creating a netherworld in the living world and actively forging their own cycle of samsara and the 6 paths of reincarnation. As for the Taoist sect in the northern complete reed continent, the lofty cloud palace's Yang clan in the Great Origin Empire's esteemed mystery department, and Heavenly Lord Xie Shi, they might not necessarily despise Gao Chang's actions as much as the Flax Robe sect and the Buddhist sect. The former will most likely stand aside and watch the tigers fight, allowing Gao Chang and the Buddhist sect to grind away at each other's strength. This is especially the case for the latter, and you should already be aware of the reason for this, so I won't explain any further. Jiang Shangzhen smiled and revealed. It was Gao Chang who shouted, "Leave the flying sword behind" back then. Chen Ping sighed and glanced down at his sword-nurturing gourd, recalling one small detail at that time. I understand. I was like a little child carrying a bag of gold through the market, and I coincidentally walked straight into Skeleton Wall City's Gao Chang. It's no wonder that he was so angry in the end. If it weren't for the ancestral hall of Wood Garment Mountain activating the mountain protection formation, I probably wouldn't have been able to leave Skeleton Shoal alive even if I managed to flee from malicious Ghost Valley. Jiang Shangzhen waved his hand and replied, "What child? You don't need to devalue yourself, and it would have been more accurate to describe you as a common man holding a gem. What do you think Gao Chang is planning to do now?" Chen Ping'an asked. Jiang Shangzhen smiled and replied, "He's probably stabbing voodoo dolls at Skeleton Wall City. It's extremely difficult to obtain a fated opportunity after letting it slip past, and trying to do so is even harder than trying to ascend the heavens. It's very challenging to explain these matters in terms of reason and principles, but cultivators in the mountains don't have the luxury to not believe these matters. The older one becomes, the more they'll believe these matters. So you actually don't need to feel too worried right now. Those who survive a catastrophe are bound to have good fortune later on." Chen Ping'an smiled bitterly and said, "I don't even dare to leave Wood Garment Mountain right now, and I'm even more afraid to venture through Skeleton Shoal to travel north. Heaven knows whether Gao Chang will secretly sneak out of malicious Ghost Valley and hack me to death." Jiang Shangzhen was just about to explain these matters a little further. However, Chen Ping'an suddenly looked into the distance with his eyes dark as he remarked, "If I were Gao Chang, then Chen Ping'an would definitely die if he dares to continue traveling around the complete reed continent." Jiang Shangzhen was immediately rendered speechless. If he said anything else and continued to encourage Chen Ping'an to travel around the complete reed continent, then it would appear as if he harbored ill intentions and ulterior motives. Chen Ping'an turned around and asked with a smile, "Jiang Shangzhen, why did you do something extra in malicious Ghost Valley and purposely sow animosity between you and Gao Chang? If my guess is correct, then according to your explanation, Gao Chang would have very likely completed a transaction with you and the Jade Tablet sect since he possesses such wild ambitions. That being the case, You could have easily seized the opportunity and become an esteemed guest of Skeleton Wall City. Zhang Shangzhen smiled faintly and replied, then it's probably me acting based on my emotions rather than logic. I can't bear to see ladies getting bullied, and I also can't stand listening to Pu Rang's bold and hair-raising words. Chen Ping'an held out his wine pot, and Zhang Shangzhen lightly clinked his wine pot against Chen Ping'an's. They then both took a swig of wine. What do you think about Zhu Quan as a person? And what do you think about Pu Rang as a ghost? And what about the attitude of the Flax Robe sect? Zhang Shangzhen suddenly asked. I feel a sense of admiration toward them, Chen Ping'an replied. Zhang Shangzhen nodded and warned, then if, and I'm saying if, you intend to continue traveling around the northern complete reed continent, then you definitely need to be careful. There are indeed people like Zhu Quan and Pu Rang here, but there are also people who appear like them on the surface but are actually powerful individuals who are even more scheming and sinister than me. Zhang Shangzhen slowly drank wine as he continued, I've suffered greatly 2 times in the northern complete reed continent, and 1 time was because of this exact reason. I almost got myself killed and helped that person count his earnings in the process. Turning around and looking back, the person holding the deadly saber surprisingly turned out to be my best friend in the northern complete reed continent. I still remember that terrible feeling even after so much time has already passed. How should I put this? My feelings were hopelessly stupid. At the time, the first thought that flashed through my mind wasn't despair or fury, and it was surprisingly a question about whether I had done something wrong to elicit such a response from my friend. I'll keep this in mind, Chen Ping'an said. Zhang Shangzhen heaved a sigh, with his expression bitter as he continued in a pitiful voice, I wouldn't have come to malicious Ghost Valley no matter what if I had known earlier that there was animosity between you and her. After all, what's the point of coming here? Chen Ping'an wanted to laugh, but he felt like doing so would be a bit too impolite. As such, he hurriedly drank some wine and swallowed his laughter into his belly. Zhang Shangzhen swayed his head as he recalled something and he said, let me tell you a piece of relatively bad news. Yang Ningxing, the innate Dao seed from the lofty cloud palace, had his evil thoughts left behind after his severing of the 3 corpses, the scholar, suffer at your hands the entire time. However, this didn't delay his proper matters, and the old Taoist priest from the small mystery capital temple seemingly helped him as a temporary Dao guardian. In the end, Yang Ningxing even managed to obtain the pair of relatively valuable luo fish from the old dragon cave. These luo fish were raised by the old turtle for 1,000 years, and they had already lived for at least 1,000 years before that. This was a decently sized fated opportunity. Don't feel doesn't matter, as things that are regarded as relatively valuable by me are genuinely very valuable. By the looks of it, this young lad is enjoying a period of flourishing fortune. If you leave malicious Ghost Valley and she's already left as well, and if you continue to travel north by yourself and once again encounter that scholar at the Great Origin Empire, then you'll have even more trouble dealing with him the second time around. These matters are nothing compared to dealing with Skeleton Wall City's Gao Cheng, Chen Ping'an replied. How did you figure out Yang Ningxing's identity and background? After all, it's already been many years since you last visited the northern complete reed continent, hasn't it? Chen Ping'an suddenly asked. Zhang Shangzhen laughed loudly and replied, do you know how many lovers I have at the northern complete reed continent, Chen Ping'an? 1 or 2 of them will travel to the Jade Tablet sect to look for me every 100 years, and they'll use all kinds of excuses to seek a reunion with me and reminisce about the past. In fact, 1 of them especially traveled to the Cloud Cave Blessed Land to look for me. It's extremely difficult to deal with the kindness and attraction from beautiful women. In any case, this is the reason why I have a thorough understanding of the northern complete reed continent. Chen Ping'an shot a sideways glance at him and commented, men being able to attract many women is naturally a type of ability, but men being able to show loyalty to a single woman is much more impressive. Zhang Shangzhen shook his hand and replied, people with different aspirations and principles will ultimately walk different paths. Apart from spending money, there's nothing else in the world that can cause me to remain loyal and unwavering. Looking back at his trip through malicious Ghost Valley, Chen Ping'an felt like he had genuinely risked his life to wander around and make some small profits here and there. He had taken even greater risks than vagrant cultivators, yet Zhang Shangzhen was sitting here and talking to him about these kinds of things. A thought occurred to Chen Ping'an. and he retrieved from his minimization treasure the 100-eye Taotai Dao robe that he had pulled off Yang Ningxing's body. Zhang Shangzhen had mentioned the old Taoist priest of the small mystery capital temple acting as a temporary Dao guardian, and this was most likely related to Yang Ningxing's strange glance before he had retreated his mind near the suspension bridge between the two cliffs. Chen Ping'an had felt like something was off at the time, and looking back at the situation now, Yang Ningxing had most likely already detected the old Taoist priest's presence. However, Yang Ningxing had probably been uncertain about fortune or misfortune at the time as well, and he hadn't dared to confirm whether the old Taoist priest harbored kind intentions or ill intentions. Zhang Shangzhen glanced at the Dao robe and nodded in acknowledgement, most likely signifying that this Dao robe was valuable enough to be appreciated by him. It's slightly higher grade than the Azure Dao robe that you're wearing right now, but its foundation is countless times better, he said slowly. Even though this black Dao robe is quite ugly, it possesses the ability to grow when given the correct nutrients like the trees and grass in this world. In other words, this Dao robe can be regarded as one of the most valuable spirit tools. The Dao robe that you wore at the Parasol Leaf Continent and the sword that Sui Yubian is wielding are both valuable spirit tools with similar features. However, each spirit tool naturally possesses its own advantages and disadvantages, similar to the cultivation potential of qi refiners. There are some people who have limited talent, and they can only crawl like turtles to the golden core tier no matter how hard they try. Meanwhile, some people can advance to the nascent tier or even the upper 5 tiers. Of the 3 valuable spirit tools, the snow-white Dao robe that you wore back then possessed the strongest potential, having the ability to reach the level of pseudo-celestial tool and beyond. Sui Yubian's sword possesses the second best potential, having the ability to become a good pseudo-celestial tool. As for this Dao robe that you snatched from Yang Ningxing, it can at most only become a pseudo-celestial tool. Moreover, this will be a slow process that requires a huge consumption of resources. This was an unexpected surprise. He had initially thought that this Dao robe and the spring grass Dao robe were quite similar, yet this Dao robe surprisingly still had a lot of room for growth. In the future, he could perhaps pretend to be a vagrant cultivator more easily when he traveled through the cultivation world after putting on a face mask and wearing this Dao robe. Chen Ping'an retrieved the 3 talismans from his sleeve and asked with a smile, "I can only tell that these are secret talismans from the lofty cloud palace, and even though I recognize the seal script characters, I know nothing about their true origin, specific use, or power. Can you take a look at them and tell me roughly how much they're worth?" Zhang Shangzhen accepted the 3 gold paper talismans from the lofty cloud palace and replied, "One is the Jade Heaven Residence talisman belonging to a side branch of Mountain Talismans, and it's one of the most famous talismans of the esteemed mystery department. Another is the Pure Jade Illumination talisman, and this talisman exudes impressive might and is able to cover a large area. However, its destructive ability is mediocre, and it works better as a talisman to frighten other people. The last talisman is the Cloud Slashing Fiend talisman, and this is a genuinely valuable talisman that contains 4 specks of divine light in its talismanic core. Even I feel slightly tempted by this talisman. However, it's not the case that everyone can use these good talismans, and it's necessary to know the many secret mantras to unlock the doors. This is especially the case for this Cloud Slashing Fiend talisman, a secret talisman among secret talismans of the lofty Cloud Palace's Yang clan. However, I coincidentally have a very good relationship with a Taoist nun from the lofty Cloud Palace, and the 2 of us are candid with each other both day and night." Zhang Shangzhen suddenly turned around with a strange expression. Chen Ping'an showed no signs of wanting to take the talismans back, and he drank small sips of wine as he said, "I know that these 3 talismans definitely aren't as valuable as your net, but something is definitely better than nothing, right?" Zhang Shangzhen slapped the 3 talismans on the railing and laughed heartily, saying, "Oh, spare me and take these away, please. I, Zhang Shangzhen, am unrestrained by heaven and earth when it comes to making money and spending money. I'm just as bold and heroic as Skeleton Pooh." Chen Ping'an turned his head and looked at Zhang Shangzhen, asking, "You really don't want them? I'm showing utmost sincerity right now. I'm not as wealthy as you, and I've always wanted to split a copper coin apart and spend it as if it were 8. "Good heavens!" Zhang Shangzhen exclaimed with a sigh. Chen Ping'an quickly took back the 3 talismans, putting them back into his minimization treasure along with the Dao robe. He smiled faintly and said, Then why don't you be a good person to the end and tell me in detail about the secret mantras for these talismans? There wasn't any displeasure on Jiang Shangzhen's face, and he instead smiled even wider as he used his mind's voice to reveal the secret mantras to Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an retrieved a golden lightning whip that he had dug out from accumulating Cloud Mountain, one that measured as long as an arm, and he asked, "What about the grade and value of this item?" "This is a manifestation of a thunder pool's veins, and it's suitable for crafting ghost-striking whips," Jiang Shangzhen replied. "It's known as a twin treasure of the world along with ghost-striking whips crafted from bamboo from Azure Divine Mountain, and these kinds of whips can innately suppress spirits and ghosts who have obtained Dao underground. However, this obviously depends on the grade of the thunder pool and bamboo as well, and the thunder pool at accumulating Cloud Mountain is still slightly lacking. If this lightning whip were crafted in the thunder pool of Stalactite Mountain, then it would already be an innate immortal treasure without needing to refine it first. Now, however, the lightning whip in your hand is only an innate spirit tool with a slightly higher grade. Moreover, the lightning whip is a bit too small, so if it were me, I would have been reluctant to even bend down to pick it up from the ground." Qian Ping'an was roughly clear about the value of these treasures now, and he thought to himself that he would refine the longest golden lightning whip into a hiking pole when he got the opportunity. He would use it for a period of time himself first, and after returning to the eastern treasured Vile continent, he could then gift it to his opening disciple. It would be golden and dazzling, appearing as attractive as could be. Since he liked the golden hiking pole, how could his disciple possibly not like it? Jiang Shangzhen smiled with squinted eyes and asked, "What other items have you recently obtained in Malicious Ghost Valley that you want me to look at and appraise?" Qian Ping'an hesitated for a moment, but he still retrieved the erotic paintings that he had obtained from Lady Bishu's bedroom wall and handed them to Jiang Shangzhen. Jiang Shangzhen's expression had initially been one of amusement, but when he saw the dual cultivation painting covered in notes, he nodded and said, "This can be viewed as a type of unorthodox cultivation, and normal earth immortals who are skilled at dual cultivation can almost treat this as a foundation to establish their own immortal force, helping cultivators at the lower 5 tiers advance to the middle 5 tiers. This is a shortcut cultivation technique, so this painting is indeed worth some money. As for the other paintings, one can enjoy them in silence if one is unable to sleep at night." "This painting is actually that precious?" Qian Ping'an asked in astonishment. Jiang Shangzhen nodded and replied, "That Moon Palace seed was simply ignorant and unable to fully utilize this painting, completely wasting the fated opportunity that was in her possession. This erotic painting is a copy of one of the 12 Dao partners in the mountain's paintings, and it's likely a work of some cultivator who defected from the charming sect in the Middle Earth Divine Continent. If you come across someone who knows their treasures, selling this painting for 20 to 30 grain rain coins should be an absolute breeze." Jiang Shangzhen couldn't help but sigh deeply in his mind after saying this, that He Xiaoyang was truly a very impressive person. Her fortune was so immense that it was bordering on terrifying. Because of this, Jiang Shangzhen didn't dare to ask for this inexpensive painting or offer to purchase it from Qian Ping'an even though he was fairly interested in it. Qian Ping'an put away the painting and also fell silent. Jiang Shangzhen changed the topic and asked, "Are you aware that the heavenly world has a genuine mystery capital temple?" "I've never heard about it before," Qian Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. A rare look of yearning appeared on Jiang Shangzhen's face, and he finished his remaining wine before casually tossing the wine pot into the distance and explaining, "That place is a genuine immortal abode, and the old temple master owns a peach tree small world and possesses incredibly paramount Dao power. As such, he's widely known as one of the Earth Ancestors." "Then what about the small mystery capital temple that's located in the peach tree forest of Malicious Ghost Valley?" Qian Ping'an asked. Jiang Shangzhen lowered his voice and replied with a smile, "It can be considered a lower sect that the mystery capital temple has left behind on the majestic world. However, it's slightly illegitimate, and I'm not especially clear about its specific inheritances either. I was in a hurry to travel to the north of the complete Reed continent back then, so I didn't enter Malicious Ghost Valley to look around. In any case, there aren't any stunning beauties in the Flax Robe sect. However, I would have definitely visited Malicious Ghost Valley if Zhu Quan were better looking." Qian Ping'an glanced at Wood Garment Mountain and the sea of clouds that were linked together with this mystical realm, places that had already fallen silent for a very long time. However, he felt like sect leader Zhu Quan hadn't given up, and she was instead building something up for a final attack. There's nothing too interesting about the small mystery capital temple, but the Great Round Moon Monastery is indeed very interesting, Zhang Shangzhen continued. Before appearing at Skeleton Shoal, that old monk had already been an eminent monk who was very well renowned throughout the entire continent. His Buddhist knowledge is profound, and it's said that he was a Buddhist seed who was defeated during a debate between the three teachings, so he confined himself to a temple afterward. As for Skeleton Pu, Pu Rang, whom you admire deeply, is actually. Zhang Shangzhen clutched his belly and roared with laughter, laughing so hard that tears almost streamed from his eyes. Pu Rang is actually a woman. This is a secret that I spent a huge sum of money to purchase, and even the Flax Robe sect might be completely oblivious to this fact. Casting one's gaze over malicious Ghost Valley, perhaps only Gao Cheng is aware of this secret as well. So what if Pu Rang is a female sword immortal? Chun Ping'an snapped in reply. After finally calming down with much difficulty, Zhang Shangzhen said with emotion, however, it's a shame that she became attracted to a monk. This naturally caused very big headaches. This update is available on NovelFire.net. There was astonishment on Chun Ping'an's face as he asked in a quiet voice, was it the old monk from the Great Round Moon Monastery? Zhang Shangzhen nodded and explained, it's because of this that Pu Rang died on the battlefield. She was doing everything in her ability to protect that temple from the flames of war. However, this is the mystical nature of the world. If she hadn't died, then the old monk could have become a bodhisattva a long time ago. Regarding the rights and wrongs and gains and losses of these matters, who can explain them clearly? Chun Ping'an came to a slight realization. Through Zhang Shangzhen's explanation, he understood why the old monk had said those words on the bank of the Black River before. This long thread had already floated to the top of the water, and the revelation about Pu Rang had made this thread even clearer. There are some issues with your mental state, Zhang Shangzhen suddenly said. According to your actions in the past, you'll only become more resolute if you detect any danger. However, even as an outsider, I could tell that your movements were very suspect when you made that final trip to Copper Stench City. Chun Ping'an nodded and explained, the living water at the source isn't limpid enough, so the mind's realm is naturally murky as a result. This is no small matter, Zhang Shangzhen commented with a smile. We'll take things slowly, Chun Ping'an said. Are you still planning to take the risk and travel to the northern complete reed continent? Zhang Shangzhen asked. I can take a step back to consider the situation, but I have to advance against the tides of difficulty when I'm walking on my 2 feet, Chun Ping'an replied. Zhang Shangzhen didn't say anything else. The Mystery Capital Temple has a Peachtree Small World, and you also own the Cloud Cave Blessed Land. Is it very tiresome to clean and maintain these places? Chun Ping'an asked. Zhang Shangzhen wrapped his hands behind his head and replied, if you like to split hairs, then it's genuinely a difficult problem that you can never solve and a difficult task that you can never finish. Chun Ping'an nodded in response and gazed into the distance. Zhang Shangzhen crossed his legs and mused. Following the departure of the 8 female heavenly officials from Ural City, this place has become a blessed land of relatively low grade. However, it's still a critical territory of the Flax Robe sect, and maintaining it well will be equivalent to having an extra unpolished jade tier cultivator. On the other hand, maintaining it badly will delay the cultivation of 2 nascent tier cultivators. At the end of the day, everything depends on Zhu Quan's abilities. After all, it takes an infinite amount of resources to maintain blessed lands, mystical realms, and small worlds. In fact, these territories require even more resources than sword immortals. Chun Ping'an, perhaps you'll also own such a place in the future, and there's one thing that you need to keep in mind when that day comes. You most definitely can't regard yourself as a living bodhisattva whose goal is to save people from pain and suffering, or else you'll end up transforming something good into something disastrous. It's important that you understand your status and act accordingly. For example, there were 50 million ants in my Cloud Cave Blessed Land during its peak, and the bamboo forest inside also enjoyed a bountiful yield not seen in 1,000 years. With the conditions ripe, Earth immortals started to pop up one after another. I became extremely smug, but I almost ended up losing my life when I descended into my blessed land to travel around. I was infuriated, and I viciously punished those ants in the blessed land. It was thanks to that decision that I enjoy my current wealth. Chen Ping'an didn't offer any comment on this. Jiang Shangzhen started to put away his immortal treasures, gradually retracting the treasures that were sealing the 8 gates corresponding to the murals and placing them inside his sleeves. However, he didn't touch the immortal treasures that were sealing the main gate in the Sea of Clouds. Jiang Shangzhen wanted to witness the grandeur of Zhu Quan's final saber strike. He would treat this as a farewell gift before he left the northern complete reed continent. Will it be very terrifying if I sincerely treat you as a friend one day? Chen Ping'an asked. Jiang Shangzhen smiled and replied, because doing so will go against your true self? Because you're afraid that you would have changed too much at that time? Perhaps that will be bad for you, Chen Ping'an. However, these are possibly the benefits and drawbacks brought about by the differences of the Great Tao. I'm someone who seeks change and adherence to the trend, and I simply need an anchor in my heart that can sink to the bottom of the lake. Regardless of the howling winds and lashing rains causing waves of 10,000 feet tall, I don't need to pay any heed to the chaos taking place on the surface of the lake. As such, I've been feeling relatively carefree and relaxed as I've walked along the path of cultivation. In addition, what kind of person and matter haven't I come across after living for so long? This has allowed me to deal with matters even more adeptly. On the other hand, you most likely seek stillness. You're also quite young, so you feel like you need to be extra careful after observing good deeds here and bad deeds there, so much so that you feel restrained no matter what you do, leading to many bumps and hiccups along the way. That being the case, cultivation will naturally become very difficult for you. On the flip side, however, you'll be tempering and improving yourself again and again, as long as you're able to safeguard your true self. There's no sense of superiority or inferiority between you and I, nor is there a sense of good or bad. It's simply the case that we each have our own fated opportunities. In reality, this notion isn't just confined to the two of us, and it's the same story for Gao Chang, Zhu Quan, the old monk, the old Taoist priest, and other people as well. When it comes to cultivation, I've always felt like the fundamental path underfoot can't be categorized as superior or inferior. I've never really believed in cultivation paths having dead ends or whatnot. From the beginning to the end, your words have all been extremely invaluable, Chen Ping'an said with a smile. Jiang Shangzhen felt especially smug, but his expression suddenly changed as he asked with a faint smile, "Then you and Sui Yubian?" Chen Ping'an was slightly puzzled. There was a strange expression on Jiang Shangzhen's face, and he clenched his hands into fists and twiddled his thumbs as he asked, "There's nothing going on between the two of you?" Chen Ping'an rolled his eyes and couldn't be bothered saying anything in response. Jiang Shangzhen shook his head and exclaimed, "You're wasting a divine treasure." There was a loud crack. A burst of saber light slashed through the sea of clouds, causing several dazzling immortal treasures to instantly shatter apart and disperse into the surroundings. Jiang Shangzhen looked up and roared with laughter, praising, "Such impressive saber skills, little Quaner. Big brother Zhou Fei is completely bedazzled and spellbound." Chen Ping'an glanced at the completely annihilated immortal treasures, and he almost felt pain for Jiang Shangzhen. This was the true definition of wasting divine treasures, right? "I'm heading off now. No need to see me off, little Quaner." Jiang Shangzhen stood up and waved his sleeve, retrieving the remaining treasures in the sky. At the same time, his bonded item, the willow leaf, slashed open one of the small gates corresponding to the murals, and he transformed into a bright streak of light as he fled into the distance. He fled so quickly that his speed was comparable to that of sword immortals traveling on their swords. Chen Ping'an felt slightly envious. If he possessed such impressive ability to escape, then perhaps he wouldn't face any dangers even if he traveled to malicious Ghost Valley again, or even if he took a stroll around Skeleton Wall City, right? Zhu Quan landed on the railing with a long saber in her hand, with her aura formidable and her murderous intent palpable. After hesitating for a moment, she decided against going to Mural City to pursue Jiang Shangzhen, and she instead shouted loudly, "Jiang Shangzhen, I'll hack off all 3 legs of yours if you dare to come to my flax robe sect again." Jiang Shangzhen suddenly poked his head out from the gate of the hanging inkstone Divine Maiden's mural and asked, "Can you use your palm instead of your saber?" Zhu Quan immediately charged over with her saber. Only after 1 entire hour did Zhu Quan finally return to the mystical realm, with a faint scent of the sea wind still lingering on her body. She had definitely pursued Jiang Shangzhen all the way to the sea. Zhu Quan felt slightly angry and annoyed as she sheathed her saber, and she sat down on the railing and extended her hand. Chen Ping'an tossed her a pot of rice wine. Zhu Quan tilted her head back and drank in large gulps, following which she asked with a dark expression, "Are you friends with Jiang Shangzhen?" Chen Ping'an was completely unfazed as he replied in a righteous voice, "We were once life and death enemies in a blessed land of the parasol leaf continent," and he was calling himself Zhou Fei at the time. Zhu Quan glanced at Chen Ping'an and snickered. The words of men are all fucking lies. Chen Ping'an drank some wine to suppress his astonishment. Zhu Quan hummed coldly and continued, "To be pissing in the same pot as Jiang Shangzhen, I reckon that you aren't a very good person either." Chen Ping'an simply drank wine in silence. "Are you silently conceding this?" Zhu Quan asked in anger. "No, I'm not," Chen Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. Zhu Quan's expression softened a little and she said, "If it weren't for your remark about showing loyalty to a single person just then, I might have not held back and given you a saber strike as well." Chen Ping'an smiled bitterly upon hearing this. "You can feel free to travel north afterward," Zhu Quan said. "I'll keep a very close eye on Skeleton Wall City, and he'll lose more than just 100 years of cultivation if he dares to show himself again. Rest assured, it's incredibly difficult for Gao Cheng to secretly sneak in and out of malicious Ghost Valley and Skeleton Shoal. The mountain protection formation of the Flax Robe sect will also remain in a half-open state afterward, so you won't face any danger at all unless Gao Cheng is willing to sacrifice half his life and plummet to at least the nascent tier. You can even feel free to swagger out of Skeleton Shoal." Chen Ping'an breathed a soft sigh of relief. Zhu Quan smiled and continued, "If I were you, I would stand near the archway buildings on the border of Skeleton Shoal and malicious Ghost Valley and curse Gao Cheng for 3 days and 3 nights. If he dares to show himself, then you can rely on the ancestral mountain deity of Wood Garment Mountain to run away. After that, you can pop up again once Gao Cheng leaves, and you can repeat this process again and again to anger Gao Cheng to death. Won't that be very satisfying? In any case, you'll be spending the money of the Flax Robe sect, and the Flax Robe sect will be very happy to spend money to support your cause. I'll probably board an immortal ship and take a detour around Skeleton Shoal, and I'll disembark the ship and continue to travel around the continent after I'm a few thousand kilometers away from Skeleton Shoal," Chen Ping'an said. Zhu Quan widened her eyes and exclaimed, "Are you inferior to even Jiang Shangzhen? If it were him, he would definitely take things even further than me if he suffered so greatly at the hands of Gao Cheng. Disregarding everything else, Jiang Shangzhen is this when it comes to making other people feel disgusted." Zhu Quan raised her thumb as she continued, "There was an immortal sect that offended Jiang Shangzhen deeply in the past, and he chose to block that sect for 10 years and make the disciples under the level of Earth Immortal feel too afraid to leave the mountains and travel around the cultivation world by themselves. Jiang Shangzhen gave them another big present before leaving, erecting 7 or 8 stone tablets that were covered in vulgarity around the mountain in a single night. He fabricated all kinds of stories, writing about the illicit sexual relationships between the old ancestors and Earth Immortals of the sect regardless of whether they were male or female. These stories were incredibly nasty and vile, but his writing ability was indeed fairly good. In fact, those erotic stories are still circulating around the mountains to this day. Why would I compare myself to Jiang Shangzhen in these regards?" Chen Ping'an asked in exasperation. Zhu Quan thought for a moment before conceding, "You have a point. It's best not to learn anything from that big pervert." Chen Ping'an breathed a sigh of relief. Interacting with sect leader Zhu Quan was even more tiresome than fighting to the death with other people. Outside the peach tree forest, a skeleton dressed in azure and carrying a sword stood beside the 2 stone tablets but didn't enter the forest. An old and emaciated monk wearing a loose Buddhist robe appeared in front of the skeleton. The skeleton was none other than City Lord Pu Rang of White Cage City, and she said in a hoarse voice, "You finally dare to come out here and meet me?" The old monk put his palms together and remained silent. Pu Rang placed her hand on the hilt of her sword, causing sword chi to instantly exude from her weapon and envelop her like a mist. In the next instant, Pu Rang was still dressed in azure and carrying a sword, but she was no longer a rack of white bones like before. Instead, she transformed into a gallant-looking woman. A myriad of fears exist in life, a life as impermanent as the morning dew. From love there arises anxiety, and from love there arises fear, she said slowly. 1. No matter how little I understand Buddhism, How can I possibly not understand these concepts? I know that it's me who's delaying you from overcoming the final barrier, and you can blame me for this. However, I've purposely traveled around malicious Ghost Valley as a skeleton for so many years to make you feel guilty. She was direct and forthright when alive, and she remained the same even as a ghost after death. Thinking back to the past, a young monk traveling around the world had coincidentally come across a young woman working in the fields in the countryside, holding seedlings in one hand and wiping her sweat with her other hand. Basking in the sunlight, the young woman, who clearly wasn't especially beautiful, had not only appeared attractive, but she had even rocked the indomitable Buddhist principles in the young monk's heart. It had been like a dream, an illusion, and it had also been as fleeting as the morning dew and lightning. The old monk maintained his low gaze and continued to hold his palms together as he replied in a quiet voice, "Benefactor Pooh doesn't need to blame herself for this. It was my mental demons that led to this result. Benefactor Pooh simply needs to focus on the great Tao to achieve immortality." Pooh Rang smiled tragically and said, "You've always been." She then turned around to leave. The old monk chanted Amitba, before also turning around to walk away. At the fork road leading to the Great Round Moon Monastery and the small mystery capital temple, the old Taoist priest suddenly materialized on the path, and the old monk stopped in his tracks. The old Taoist priest seemingly wanted to ask his old neighbor a question. The old monk had already guessed the question a long time ago, and he explained slowly, when standing on the bank of the Black River, that young benefactor once said, "One needs to have the proper mindset to achieve the proper results." In fact, I also have some words that I didn't say to him. One can definitely achieve the proper results with the proper mindset. Why didn't you say this to him? The old Taoist priest asked. The old monk smiled faintly and replied, "Buddha is within, so seek not distant help. Seek not outside help." The old Taoist priest shook his head and disappeared with a flash. The old monk remained standing in the same spot, and he bent down and extended his hand as if he were scooping up some water. "Sowing the fields with your hands, looking down and seeing the sky and the water," he murmured to himself. An immortal ship originating from Skeleton Shoal didn't sail directly north, and it instead sailed towards someplace bordering the sea in the southeast. Night fell, and Chen Ping'an flicked through a military book under the candlelight. Chen Ping'an put away the military book and flipped open a book that was similar to the Flax Robe Sex Be at Ease compilation. This book was called Spring Dew and Winter, and it was a small book that introduced the immortal force that owned this immortal ship. The book was quite interesting, and there were stories both long and short talking about which sword immortal of the northern complete reed continent had rested on their mountain before, which earth immortal had drank tea and discussed Tao at which famous landmark, what poems and essays the literati had written for their mountain, what paintings the literati had composed, and so on. Chen Ping'an was traveling on an immortal ship owned by the Spring Dew Garden, and the main income source of this immortal ship was from selling strange and wonderful plants raised by the immortal force as it traveled to the different regions. Among these plants, there were 3 types of immortal flowers that were essentially monopolized by the Flax Robe sect, thereby creating a huge income source for the Spring Dew Garden. Because of this, the route of the immortal ship started and finished at an area between Skeleton Shoal and the Finewood Mountain Range, where the Spring Dew Garden was located. The Spring Dew Garden belonged to the school of agrarianism of the 100 schools of thought, and the majority of cultivators in this immortal force were female cultivators who largely had warm and gentle personalities. At the same time, the Finewood Mountain Range was rich with wonderful wood and plant spirits, and this allowed the Spring Dew Garden to become a very wealthy second-rate immortal force in the southeastern region of the complete reed continent. In addition to this, the Spring Dew Garden had many friends and few enemies, so the Finewood Mountain Range was a place that young official immortals from the south would definitely travel to when they left the mountains to travel and train. There were 3 reasons why Chen Ping'an had chosen to take this immortal ship. Firstly, traveling on this immortal ship would allow him to take a detour around Skeleton Shoal. Secondly, the Spring Dew Garden had 3 unique treasures passed down through the generations, one of which was an old locust tree that had lived in the Finewood Mountain Range for 10,000 years and measured dozens of meters tall. Chen Ping'an wanted to take a look at this locust tree and see how it was different from the old locust tree from his hometown. Lastly, the Spring Dew Garden would host a farewelling the year banquet whenever New Year's Eve was around the corner. At this time, thousands of wandering merchants would gather together to sell their wares, creating a grand event where immortal coins flew around everywhere. Chen Ping'an planned to do some small business at this banquet. The small book introducing the Spring Dew Garden wasn't thin, but compared to the extremely detailed Be at Ease compilation. In reality, Chen Ping'an felt slightly disappointed that he hadn't been able to collect similar books at the Parasol Leaf Continent's Planchette Writing Sect and the other immortal forces. After finishing the small book, Chen Ping'an started to practice the six-step walking meditation. In the end, he was essentially half asleep as he continued to walk from the window to the door as he practiced the fist stance, yet his footsteps didn't stray in the least. Dawn arrived, and Chen Ping'an opened his eyes and stopped practicing walking meditation, returning to the seat beside the table and sitting down to wait. Only when someone knocked on his door did he stand up and answer it. A steward of the immortal ship was standing outside, and he was an elderly golden core tier cultivator, and one of the few male cultivators in the Spring Dew Garden. He appeared lethargic and aged, and he couldn't compare to the flax-robed sex Du Wenxi or Yang Lin at all. They were all at the same cultivation base, yet the gulf between them was still incredibly large. If they were to engage in a fight, it was very likely that victory and defeat would be decided in the blink of an eye. However, this wasn't to say that cultivators from the Spring Dew Garden were pushovers, and it was instead a reflection of the fact that cultivators from the Flax Robe sect were a special breed who treated life and death battles as normal everyday occurrences. After Chen Ping'an opened the door, the old cultivator said in an apologetic voice, "Sorry for disturbing your rest, fellow cultivator." Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "There's no need to be so polite, Senior Song. I only just woke up as well, and according to the introductions in the book, we should be approaching the Tao Partner Mountains in Golden Light Peak and Moonlight Mountain soon. I plan to head out to try my luck, and I want to see whether I can come across any goldback geese or drum croak frogs." The old cultivator smiled faintly and said, "I've come here for this exact reason, and I wanted to remind young Master Chen that you can enter the territory of Golden Light Peak in approximately 4 hours. The Golden Core Tier cultivator used a slightly more friendly title, referring to Chen Ping'an as young Master Chen instead of fellow cultivator. He was repaying the favor since Chen Ping'an had referred to him as Senior Song. Chen Ping'an hurriedly moved aside and said, "Please come inside, Senior Song." The old cultivator gave a knowing smile. When the difference in cultivation base was small between cultivators from the mountains, for example, one was at the Sea Observation tier and one was at the Dragon Gate tier, then referring to each other as fellow cultivators would be sufficient. When cultivators at the lower 5 tiers came across cultivators at the middle 5 tiers, or when cultivators at the Abode tier, Sea Observation tier, or Dragon Gate tier came across Earth Immortals at the Golden Core tier or Nascent tier, however, those at the lower tiers would need to refer to those at the higher tiers as Esteemed Immortal or Senior. The Golden Core tier was a threshold, hence the saying, "Those who form a Golden Core will become one of us." This was a rule in the mountains that rang true no matter where one traveled. Of course, if one were courageous enough, those at the lower 5 tiers could still boldly refer to Earth Immortals or even upper 5 tier cultivators as fellow cultivators. This was fine as long as one wasn't afraid of being smacked to death. The old man was a Golden Core tier cultivator, yet he had still referred to the young guest as a fellow cultivator, so there was clearly a particular reason for this. The person who had accompanied this young cultivator to the immortal ship was Pang Lanxi, a direct disciple of the Flax Robe sect's ancestral hall, and an extremely renowned young prodigy. It was said that Pang Lanxi could perhaps become one of the top 10 young prodigies in the Northern Complete Reed continent within the next 60 years. If other sects bragged about their disciples, it was most likely to express their hope rather than a statement of truth. As such, their claims could be regarded as little more than jokes. If people came across such claims, they simply needed to smile and nod and curse in their minds, telling these shameless fools to piss off. However, the Spring Dew Garden was a frequent visitor to Skeleton Shoal, so they knew that the cultivators of Flax Robe sect were a different breed. These cultivators didn't brag, and they instead let their ruthless actions do the talking. So be it if it were only Pang Lanxi who had represented the Flax Robe sect to farewell the guest, and this naturally couldn't compare to sect leader Zhu Quan or Mural City's Yang Lin appearing to see off a guest. However, this elderly Golden Core tier cultivator was always traveling around, and he wasn't the type of immortal who would cultivate in seclusion for 10 years or several decades whenever he felt like it. As such, he had developed exceptional observation skills, and he had gauged through Pang Lanqi's speech and expressions that the young prodigy surprisingly had deep and sincere admiration for the young wanderer, someone whom even he couldn't gauge the abilities of. That being the case, the elderly golden courtier cultivator naturally had to think hard about how he treated Qian Ping'an. In addition to this, astounding commotion had just taken place at Malicious Ghost Valley and Skeleton Shoal, and Skeleton Wall City's Gao Cheng had even summoned his colossal skeleton Dao manifestation and personally pursued a streak of golden sword light that had fled toward Wood Garment Mountain. The elderly cultivator wasn't stupid, so he was naturally able to connect some dots together. This was a chance encounter between two cultivators from the mountains, so one party opening the door and inviting the other inside was a show of deep sincerity. When it came to cultivators from the mountains, they weren't joking at all when they talked about keeping distance from the mortal world. The elderly golden courtier cultivator's name was Song Lanqiao, and according to the genealogical records kept in the ancestral hall of the immortal force, he was a cultivator who belonged to the Lan generation of the Spring Dew Garden. Almost all of the cultivators in the Spring Dew Garden were females, so it naturally wasn't a big deal for them to have the character Lan in their names. However, this was slightly strange for a male, so Song Lanqiao's master had added the extra character Qiao to suppress the feminine nature of the character Lan. Before boarding the immortal ship, Qian Ping'an had only learned about Golden Light Peak and Moonlight Mountain being Dao partner mountains from Pang Lanqi. If one were fortunate enough, one could even see spirit beasts and peculiar matters when they traveled to these mountains on an immortal ship. As such, Qian Ping'an had been very attentive the entire time after boarding the ship. And now Song Lanqiao had coincidentally come here to remind Qian Ping'an of the matter and help answer any questions. As it turned out, goldback geese would occasionally appear around the vicinity of Golden Light Peak. These geese were as quick as sword immortals traveling on their flying swords, and they would only slow down slightly and linger for a while longer when they arrived near the uniquely blessed Golden Light Peak. Apart from cultivators at or above the nascent tier, ordinary cultivators didn't need to dream about capturing goldback geese. Moreover, goldback geese were extremely fiery and unyielding, and they would choose to self-immolate and die if they were caught, leaving their capturers empty-handed. Goldback geese liked to soar among the rolling sea of clouds, and they especially liked to bathe in the sunlight. Because their backs were always exposed to the blazing sun and absorbing the essence of the sunlight, mature-aged goldback geese possessed the ability to grow a single golden feather. It was rare for them to grow two, and it was even rarer for them to grow three. There was a nascent tier vagrant cultivator who had already been famous for a very long time in the southern region of the northern complete reed continent, and thanks to the strings of fate and destiny, an old ancestor of the goldback geese which was covered in gold feathers had voluntarily recognized him as its master. The goldback goose possessed the combat power of a golden core tier cultivator, and it would appear like the brilliant rising sun when it beat its wings and soared into the sky. The nascent tier vagrant cultivator also had a hobby of surprising people, so he had blinded the eyes of countless cultivators under the level of Earth Immortal with his goldback goose. After advancing to the nascent tier, however, he had fallen much quieter and become a cultivator who nurtured himself in relative peace and silence. It was only then that people were no longer able to see the dazzling goldback goose. As for Moonlight Mountain, a giant snow-white frog that was as large as a mountain would bring its descendants to the mountain peak and croak non-stop whenever it was the 1st and 15th day of the new month. These frogs would appear like meditating cultivators as they absorbed the essence of the moon. When the Mid-Autumn Festival arrived, Moonlight Mountain would be covered in even more frogs that croaked in a thunderous manner. Because of this, Moonlight Mountain was also widely known as Thunder Mountain. There were naturally cultivators who wanted to tame the giant frog, but the giant frog possessed incredible innate talent, and was especially skilled at earth element techniques and escape techniques. It was able to shrink its gigantic body to the size of a dust particle, and then hide itself in the earth veins and mountain roots. Once it did so, Moonlight Mountain would also become as heavy as the 5 mountains or a large nation, meaning that even nascent tier cultivators wouldn't be able to uproot and move the mountain. That being the case, cultivators often traveled to Moonlight Mountain in an attempt to catch a few snow-white drum croak frogs of 100 years old. However, they would be fortunate to succeed, as the giant frog ancestor was extremely protective of its descendants. Indeed, many middle 5-tier cultivators had already lost their lives at Moonlight Mountain. Song Lanxiao told some humorous and embarrassing stories about the experiences of cultivators on Moonlight Mountain, and Chen Ping'an sat there and listened on with keen interest and enjoyment. There was once a person who had caught a gold-back goose with a large net, yet several gold-back geese had grabbed the net in their beaks and soared high into the sky. The cultivator had been unwilling to let go no matter what, and they had eventually been dragged into the clouds extremely high above the ground. When they finally let go, they had already lost all of their clothes and become riddled with injuries from the gold-back geese pecking them again and again. Moreover, they hadn't possessed any pocket treasures or similar storage treasures to take out a new change of clothes, so they had appeared extremely disheveled when falling back to Golden Light Peak completely naked. The cultivators enjoying the show at the peak of the mountain had jeered at their appearance, and this was only made worse by the fact that the victim had actually been a female sea observation tier cultivator from a large immortal force. Afterward, this female cultivator had never left the mountain to travel around the cultivation world again. There aren't cave abodes constructed by cultivators on either Golden Light Peak or Moonlight Mountain? Chen Ping'an asked in curiosity. This chapter is updated by novelfire.net. Song Lanxiao stroked his beard and replied, "The sunlight essence at Golden Light Peak is far too scalding, and this is especially the case since the sunlight essence gathered on the mountain is especially unstable and unpredictable. As a result, Golden Light Peak isn't a good place to cultivate unless an earth immortal can endure the scalding heat to cultivate there continuously for a long time. It's incredibly difficult for ordinary cultivators to cultivate at Golden Light Peak in thatched cottages, and most people will simply be wasting their spiritual energy if they try. As for Moonlight Mountain, this is a place with top-notch feng shui and all of the 5 elements. However, it's a shame that the giant frog has taken over this mountain, along with his thousands of descendants and disciples. Moreover, this giant frog developed intelligence a long time ago, and feels very strong animosity toward qi refiners like us, not allowing any qi refiners to enter the mountain to cultivate. There are all kinds of creatures in the mountains and rivers, and each creature lives according to its own unique set of values, Chen Ping'an said with a nod. Song Lanxiao appeared to be in strong agreement with Chen Ping'an's remark, and he smiled as he bade farewell and took his leave. He needed to be warm and polite, but taking things too far would be stooping to a very low level. He was a golden courtier cultivator after all, so he still cared about his face and wouldn't actively butter up to someone and act inferior to them. Of course, it would be a different story if he needed to ask someone for help. Song Lanxiao shook his head after leaving, thinking that the young cultivator was only looking at things in a superficial manner. Regarding the gold-back geese of Golden Light Peak and the drum-croak frogs of Moonlight Mountain, it was ultimately only a rare few species of mountain spirits that weren't confined to cages. After all, how many spirits were killed and sold for money? Considering just the tree and plant spirits of Finewood Mountain Range, how many of them were traded, and how many of them died during transportation? Managing to survive and being raised as a pet by the wealthy clans of the mortal empires was already a huge fortune. The immortal ship stopped for 2 hours when it arrived near Golden Light Peak, yet the passengers failed to catch sight of a single gold-back goose. Song Lanxiao offered some explanations as he stood beside Chen Ping'an, saying that even those cultivators who coveted gold-back geese and had waited here for several years might have only seen them a rare few times. The immortal ship of the Spring Dew Garden continued to slowly sail forward, coincidentally passing by Moonlight Mountain when it was nighttime. However, it didn't dare to steer too close to the mountain, maintaining a distance of 3 to 4 kilometers as it circled the mountain once. It wasn't the 1st or the 15th day of the new month, so the giant frog naturally didn't appear on the mountain. This made Song Lanxiao feel slightly awkward, especially since the giant frog would occasionally appear atop the mountain peak to absorb the essence of the moon on other days as well. As such, Song Lanxiao didn't even show up beside Chen Ping'an this time. He saw the young cultivator wearing the bamboo hat only returning to his room when the immortal ship sailed far away from Moonlight Mountain. Song Lanxiao couldn't help but smile bitterly. This young man's luck was very ordinary. It would be extravagantly hopeful to see a gold-back goose when the immortal ship sailed past this pair of Dao partner mountains, and Song Lanxiao had only seen them fewer than 10 times after working as the steward of this immortal ship for more than 200 years. However, there was roughly a 50-50 chance for passengers of the immortal ship to see the giant frog of Moonlight Mountain. 2 days passed, and the immortal ship slowly gained altitude. The young cultivator actively sought out Song Lanqiao, asking him why the immortal ship was suddenly rising higher. Song Lanqiao didn't try to hide anything, especially since this was a semi-open secret regarding the immortal ship's route. This wasn't a forbidden secret of their immortal force. There were many tricks and secrets regarding stable routes that had already been operated for many years, and immortal ships would often lower their altitude when sailing past beautiful mountains and rivers. The reason was to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, and thus slightly reduce the expenditure of immortal coins needed to sail the immortal ship. On the other hand, maintaining a low altitude when sailing past so-called lawless lands with a paucity of spiritual energy would lead to a higher expenditure of immortal coins, so immortal ships would naturally increase their altitude to avoid this extra cost. As for how to navigate these situations in the territories of immortal forces without breaking their rules yet making some small earnings at the same time, this was largely up to the skills and experience of those steering the immortal ships. Even more important than this was the ability to build a suitable relationship with each local force. These matters weren't necessarily taboos or secrets, so Song Lanqiao didn't hold back as he explained them to Qian Pinyin. This could also be regarded as building some goodwill with the young cultivator. In any case, explaining these things didn't cost Song Lanqiao a single copper coin. Through his interactions with Qian Pinyin, Song Lanqiao also speculated that this young cultivator from another continent was most likely the direct disciple of an old ancestor from a large sect, the type of disciple who was completely focused on cultivation and understood little about the world. Otherwise, it didn't make sense for him to know nothing about the simple secrets regarding the operations of immortal ships. After all, there was a strong and clear correlation between an immortal force's foundation and wealth and the distance that their immortal ships could travel, whether that be a measly few tens of thousands of kilometers, enough distance to cover half a continent, or enough distance to embark on intercontinental journeys. When asking Song Lanqiao about the change in altitude of the immortal ship, Qian Pinyin had retrieved a pot of immortal wine that he had purchased at Skeleton Shoal. This immortal wine was called Wind and Hail wine, and it was an extremely potent wine that wasn't as renowned as gloomy tea. Song Lanqiao suddenly left his room one day, ordering the immortal ship to descend to a lower altitude. He walked to the bow of the immortal ship after approximately 15 minutes and stood with his hands on the railing, peering down at the mountains and rivers below. The old cultivator couldn't help but click his tongue in wonder as he vaguely saw a peculiar scene below. The immortal ship wasn't very far from the ground, and the weather was also clear, allowing an excellent view of the terrain below. Even so, ordinary cultivators would still be unable to notice the peculiar scene on the ground. Song Lanqiao was only observing this for his amusement, and he wouldn't leave the immortal ship to interfere in the matters below. It could be argued that he was wasting the Spring Dew Garden's money for personal gain, but the old ancestor responsible for managing the finances of the immortal force wouldn't care much about spending a few dozen more snowflake coins over a period of 7 or 8 minutes. At most, he would only ask Song Lanqiao whether he had seen any new or interesting things. A golden courtier cultivator wasting their time acting as a steward of an immortal ship was a clear sign that they were a pitiful person who had reached a dead end in their pursuit of the great Tao. As such, ordinary cultivators didn't dare to provoke such stewards, especially if they were an earth immortal. Qian Pinyin walked over to where Song Lanqiao was standing, gazing down at the city that was enveloped in hazy black mist and asking, "Elder Song, why is there black mist enveloping that city? You have very good eyesight, young Master Qian. Even I'm having some trouble seeing things clearly." Song Lanqiao stroked his beard and remarked. He then chuckled and continued, "That's a prefectural city of the Silver Screen Nation, and the aura around it is so clear because it appears like the city is going to face a calamity soon. There are 2 potential reasons for this, with one being demons causing trouble. The other potential reason is the local mountain god, river god, or city god appointed by the imperial court reaching a dire state where their godly body has decayed significantly and is about to crumble. The Silver Screen Nation seems to have a large territory, but it's actually a genuinely minor nation in the southeastern region of the northern complete reed continent. This is because the nation lacks spiritual energy and is unable to produce many chi refiners, and even if it does, it loses these cultivators to other nations with better conditions and opportunities. So despite its size, the Silver Screen Nation is a poor and undeveloped nation that chi refiners don't like to visit. Official source is novelwire.net. Song Lanxiao was clearly treating Chen Ping'an as a young and inexperienced cultivator who had just left the mountains as he explained this, and the elderly golden courtier cultivator quickly realized the inappropriate nature of his explanation. However, he breathed a sigh of relief when he carefully observed Chen Ping'an's expression and saw that he was still listening intently. Sure enough, he was an esteemed disciple of some sect-level immortal force of another continent. Thankfully, he was from the Spring Dew Garden, a friendly immortal force. Otherwise, if this young man were traveling on an immortal ship owned by some powerful force in the central region or northern region of the northern complete reed continent, he would very likely be teased and harassed once the others found out about his identity. Once the conflict escalated and both sides became emotionally charged, they would probably refrain from fighting to the death on the immortal ship. However, the cultivators who picked on this young man would definitely find an opportunity to disguise themselves as vagrant cultivators and kill him before destroying all evidence. This was a common occurrence in the northern complete reed continent. Song Lanxiao hesitated for a moment before swallowing the words of warning that had already reached the tip of his tongue. Disciples from large sects cared a lot about their face, so if he gilded the lily and warned Chen Ping'an about these dangers, it was entirely likely that the young man would resent him instead of thanking him for his goodwill. Chen Ping'an looked around and adjusted his bamboo hat, saying with a smile, "Senior Song, I'm a bit bored and have nothing to do right now, so I'm going to head down to take a look and entertain myself. I might arrive at the Spring Dew Garden a bit later, but I'll definitely visit you and treat you to some wine at that time. Also, I might affect the formation of the immortal ship when I leave in a moment." Song Lanxiao faltered upon hearing this, feeling slightly surprised by Chen Ping'an's decision. However, cultivators always acted according to their hearts, so he didn't say anything extra or try to dissuade Chen Ping'an. He simply said a few auspicious words to bid Chen Ping'an farewell. Afterward, the elderly golden courtier cultivator saw Chen Ping'an's expression become slightly awkward. Why didn't he soar away on his sword? If this were too eye-catching, then surely he could fly away on the wind? Chen Ping'an had no option but to pat his sword nurturing gourd before placing one hand on the railing and jumping overboard. He casually slashed apart the formation of the immortal ship with one hand and dashed out, appearing as quick as an arrow as he soared away and seemingly stood atop the tip of a burst of dark green sword light. Chen Ping'an then bent his knees slightly and instantly exerted immense force, causing his body to lean forward and rapidly swoop down. Huge ripples appeared in the surroundings, with thunderous booms traveling through the air. The eyelids of Song Lanxiao twitched as he watched on. How very impressive. So be it if he were just a young sword immortal, but he even possessed a physique as tough as a Vajra body tier martial artist? Fucking sword cultivators. Chen Ping'an landed on the peak of a mountain and waved goodbye to Song Lanxiao from far away. Song Lanxiao also waved goodbye in response. This young man was someone who understood etiquette, after all, so the elderly cultivator couldn't bring himself to dislike him. Just how difficult was it for cultivators in the mountains to enjoy amicable encounters and amicable partings? Chen Ping'an retrieved a bamboo box and slung it on his back. Sword Immortal was unwilling to leave its scabbard, and it was clear that it was still throwing a small tantrum after not being allowed to enjoy a hearty battle at malicious Ghost Valley. As for First, whose original name was Little Capital, Chen Ping'an didn't dare to let it carelessly leave his sword-nurturing gourd. Chen Ping'an retrieved his walnut bracelet and wore it around his wrist, after which he retrieved the 3 talismans from the lofty Cloud Palace and placed them inside his left sleeve. Failing to come across gold-back geese and drum-croak frogs on Golden Light Peak and Moonlight Mountain respectively, was a good outcome. This was one of the subtle reasons why Chen Ping'an had chosen to travel on the Spring Dew Garden's immortal ship. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment, but he didn't rush himself to go anywhere. Instead, he found a quiet and secluded place and started to refine the longest golden lightning whip that he had obtained at accumulating Cloud Mountain. After approximately 4 hours, Chen Ping'an managed to refine the lightning whip into the rough shape that he wanted. Holding a hiking pole in his hand, he then started to walk toward the prefectural city of the Silver Screen Nation that was still roughly 20 to 30 kilometers away. When parting ways with Pang Lanxi at the ferry station before, the young man had gifted Chen Ping'an 2 sets of premium mural replicas, the proudest works of his great-grandfather that were genuinely worth a fortune. A single set was worth 1 grain rain coin, but it still couldn't be purchased because there was none available on the market. However, Pang Lanshi had told Chen Ping'an that he didn't need to pay, revealing that his great-grandfather had remarked that Chen Ping'an's sincere words in the immortal residence were extremely refreshing and refined. His words had been like fragrant orchids and nothing like basic words of flattery. Hearing this, Chen Ping'an had shamelessly accepted the 2 sets of Divine Maiden mural replicas, smiling and saying to Pang Lanshi that he would definitely enjoy some merry drink and chat with his great-grandfather the next time he visited Skeleton Shoal. Pang Lanshi was an honest person, and he had replied that his great-grandfather had already given away all 3 sets of his remaining mural replicas, 2 to Chen Ping'an and 1 to the old ancestor responsible for maintaining rule and order in the ancestral hall. As such, Chen Ping'an would be asking a lot of his great-grandfather if he wanted to obtain another set of mural replicas by lavishing him with praise. With his expression sincere, Chen Ping'an had said that Pang Lanshi's great-grandfather definitely possessed a profound artistic conception in his mind. He was already incredibly familiar with the spiritual auras of the female heavenly officials depicted in Mural City, so it would be as if he were being assisted by the gods once he raised his brush and put ink to paper. From his heart to the brush, and from the brush to the paper, the divine maidens would appear spirited and lifelike as they were brought into existence, and they would seemingly be in tacit understanding with Pang Lanshi's great-grandfather as his divine skills created them with smoothness and ease. A dumbstruck expression had appeared on Pang Lanshi's face. However, the young man had been slightly reluctant to part ways when Chen Ping'an had boarded the immortal ship and sailed far away. He had wanted to learn more about the principles that Chen Ping'an had comprehended from drinking. At the same time, an old ancestor of the Flax Robe sect had been standing far away from the immortal ship and looking down at his palm. Standing beside him, Pang Shanliang had nodded and said with a faint smile, "His words are very much to my liking." The old ancestor had been rendered speechless for a long time, unable to say anything fancy. In the end, he could only give up and ask, "Do you actually believe his cliched words of flattery?" Pang Shanliang had raised a brow and retorted, "Am I able to hear these words of flattery at your Flax Robe sect?" The old ancestor had become infuriated upon hearing this, and he had loudly scolded the young wanderer for being utterly shameless. If it weren't for his relatively proper attitude towards women, it was very likely that he would become a second Zhang Shangzhen in the future. At the time, Chen Ping'an had only known that the old ancestor of the Flax Robe sect and Pang Lanshi were definitely using immortal observation techniques to observe him and Pang Lanshi from afar. However, he had been completely oblivious to the irritation and anger of the old ancestor. Holding just a hiking pole, a young wanderer dressed in azure and carrying a bamboo box on his back walked along the cold and desolate small mountain paths of winter. He hoped that the small rat spirit guarding the gates of Sheep Intestine Palace would have an endless supply of books to read, and that he could safely return with bountiful yields of new books in his bookcase every time he traveled between Malicious Ghost Valley and Skeleton Shoal. He hoped that the 2 demons on the suspension bridge would focus on cultivation and refrain from doing bad deeds, allowing them to attain Tao and achieve immortality. He hoped that the old turtle could make up for his mistakes after returning to the temple to learn Buddhist scriptures, thereby correcting his ways and achieving Buddhahood. He wondered whether the young fox spirit hiding behind her small green umbrella on Treasure Mirror Mountain could find a good man who held the umbrella for her and blocked out the rain. He wondered whether the skeleton sword cultivator called Pu Rang could one day be more than just a skeleton in azure wielding a sword, returning to the world as a woman who smiled without worries. Chen Ping'an didn't know whether these things would happen or not. This was just like how he didn't know that in the slightly oblivious Pang Lanshi's eyes, in the small rat spirit's eyes, and in the eyes of the young scholar Chao Qinglang in the faraway lotus flower-blessed land, encountering Chen Ping'an was like him encountering Mr. Qi and Aoyang during his childhood. It was the end of winter, with the weather cold and the sky bleak. The mountains were frozen and the clouds were still, and as Chen Ping'an looked around, all that entered his gaze was an endless expanse of silence and desolation. This was the color of the world, something that certainly couldn't be appreciated when one peered down at the vast lands from atop immortal ships. It was because of this that cultivators in the mountains didn't understand the harsh winters and blazing summers of the world. The hiking pole in Chen Ping'an's hand, which he had refined using the immortal mantra of the Green Roving Palace, was verdant green in color, causing the golden lightning whip to appear more like a bamboo whip instead. This was because the hiking pole would be far too eye-catching if it were a dazzling gold. However, this roughly formed ghost-striking whip that had only undergone initial refinement could easily return to its original form once Jian Lai deactivated a certain restriction. There was one good thing about the northern complete reed continent, and the fact that people only spoke a single official dialect, meaning no need to worry about being unable to communicate with other people. This was as opposed to the eastern treasured vial continent and the parasol leaf continent where there were countless official dialects and local dialects in each nation, making it extremely difficult to communicate when traveling around the continent. Jian Lai walked to the foot of the mountain, and there was still not a single person in the surroundings. He gently pinched a yang energy illumination talisman between 2 fingers, and saw that it was burning at a normal speed, meaning that it was unlikely for there to be demons causing trouble in the prefectural city. In other words, it was very likely that the second possibility that Steward Song Lanqiao had mentioned was taking place, with some deity of the prefectural city facing a large tribulation and having their godly body approach a state of collapse. This in turn affected the feng shui and fortune of the prefectural city, thereby causing natural calamities to also descend. However, nothing in the world was absolute, so Jian Lai planned to take things one step at a time. He slowly walked forward with the talisman in his hand, all the way until he saw an ox-drawn cart piled high with firewood in the distance. There was a sturdy man in tattered clothes walking toward the prefectural city with his young son and young daughter who had many frostbites on their hands, and it was only upon seeing them that Jian Lai extinguished the talisman between his fingers. Jian Lai quickly walked toward the 3 people, and the eyes of the 2 little children were filled with curiosity. However, children from the regions were generally very shy, so they both shrunk back and moved closer to their father. Meanwhile, the sturdy man in tattered clothes didn't say anything when he saw the young man holding a hiking pole and carrying a bamboo case on his back. The chilly winter froze the ground, and the ox-drawn cart violently rocked back and forth as it trundled over the extremely solid ground. The sturdy man didn't dare to walk too fast upon seeing this, as the firewood would fetch a lower price if it were to break. The stewards of the wealthy clans and forces in the prefectural city were all extremely shrewd and eagle-eyed, and they were the best at creating conflict and causing trouble. When they offered aggressively low prices, their words and arguments would be even colder than the inescapable winter chill. This was a coldness that chilled one to the core. However, slowing down caused suffering for his 2 little children, forcing them to endure the biting cold for a much longer time. This caused the man to feel slightly gloomy. He had told them not to follow along for fun before, saying that there was nothing interesting to look at in the city. The only difference was the scary-looking stone lions outside the residences and the slightly larger door gods, things that would become bland once they were seen a few times. He would naturally buy some snacks and bring them back for his children if the firewood sold for a good price, and he would also buy all of the New Year goods that they needed. The man breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the silhouette of the prefectural city's tall city wall, and the bustling crowds in the city meant that the temperature inside would be slightly warmer than outside. As such, his children would probably forget about the cold once their attention was captured by something else. However, the young man wearing a bamboo hat walked at a medium pace and followed behind the ox-drawn cart the entire time, causing the man to feel slightly worried. SS Novel Fire Net. Jian Lai walked slightly faster and asked with a smile, "Hi brother. I'm an outsider who's traveled here from far away, so can you please tell me the name of this prefectural city? Is there anywhere worth visiting in the city?" The man was a quiet and taciturn person, but he didn't dare to feign deafness or muteness at this moment. As such, he could only force a smile and reply in a hoarse voice, "This is called Imperial Accompanying City, and it was said that a past emperor personally bestowed this name upon the city after falling sick when traveling south and recuperating in this city for a period of time. I only know about the city god temple in the north and the fire god shrine in the south being the most popular locations on most days, so young master can visit these places to take a look." "Alright, then I'll enter the city and visit these 2 places," Jian Lai said with a smile and a nod. He then lightly placed a hand on the ox-drawn cart and continued, "We're coincidentally heading to the same place, and I'm not in a rush either, so how about we enter the city together? That way, I can also ask brother a bit more about the situation of Imperial Accompanying City." The man appeared slightly uneasy, but upon looking up and seeing the city gate draw closer and closer, He felt like it was highly unlikely for anything to go wrong. This allowed him to feel slightly more at ease, and he tried his best to speak like a more refined city dweller as he replied, "Then I'll say what I know. It's best if I can help young master. But please forgive me if I say something wrong. I've never gone to school before, so please tolerate my mistakes." With one hand holding his hiking pole and one hand resting on the ox-drawn cart, Jian Lai said, "No worries, please go ahead and speak without worry." The man introduced whatever came to mind, and Jian Lai learned from this that Imperial Accompanying City wasn't a small city in the Silver Screen Nation. This city had produced a prime minister in the past, so both the city god temple and the star deity pagoda enjoyed a huge number of worshippers and incense offerings. The fire god shrine was also very popular, and it was said that it was very efficacious to pray for wealth there. As such, those who were wealthy and dealt with large transactions in the city all liked to visit the fire god shrine to pray and offer incense. Because of this, the man also planned to bring his ox-drawn cart to the market near the fire god shrine to sell his firewood. Afterward, he could directly buy some New Year goods from the shops nearby. The two little children secretly looked at Jian Lai the entire time, but they would immediately turn their heads and appear slightly embarrassed whenever Jian Lai smiled at them. Before they knew it, the ox-drawn cart had already arrived in front of the city gate. It was still quite early in the day, however, so they needed to line up and wait their turn to enter the city. There was a breakfast stall nearby, so Jian Lai bought a bowl of congee and a wrap before taking off his bamboo hat and sitting down to eat. The two children nearby gulped in envy upon seeing this, and the man hesitated for a moment before grabbing a small handful of copper coins and handing them to his daughter. The two children happily ran toward the breakfast stall after receiving the money, and they also bought a bowl of congee and a fragrant egg and vegetable wrap like Jian Lai. The little girl carried the wrap to her father, and the man only took a bite before tearing it into two and returning it to his daughter. The little girl ran back to the table and handed one half of the wrap to her little brother, after which they started to eat the bowl of congee together. The man guarded the cart of firewood, and there was a grin on his face as he wiped his mouth. Business at the breakfast stall was fairly good, and the two little children were sitting opposite Jian Lai. Jian Lai had already developed a habit of chewing slowly and thinking as he ate. When traveling around malicious Ghost Valley before, he had constantly schemed against the scholar, and also fought head-on against the Golden Eagle spirit of accumulating Cloud Mountain. In reality, however, neither of these conflicts had been especially dangerous. On the other hand, his journey from Copper Stench City to Green Cottage Town was a different story. More precisely, it was the time when he had stepped off the intercontinental ship of the Flax Robe sect, and the time when he had slashed open the sky to flee to Wood Garment Mountain. Jian Lai still felt a sense of lingering apprehension regarding these two events, and he felt like he had walked a tightrope between life and death when he reviewed his experiences several times after fleeing from malicious Ghost Valley. Upon thinking of his bountiful yields of immortal coins and precious treasures, however, Jian Lai felt like he had nothing to mope or complain about. The only disappointment was the lack of opportunity to engage in more fights. The conflicts had been quite ordinary, and they had surprisingly ended up inferior to his training sessions in the bamboo building at Downtrodden Mountain. It was nowhere near satisfying enough. Perhaps things would have been more exciting if the mountain-moving great sage had joined forces with the Imperial Thunder Divine General of Accumulating Cloud Mountain, or if an upper 5-tier heroic spirit like Gao Chang continued to covet his treasures as he traveled north. Afterward, Jian Lai had rested and recuperated at the Immortal Residence on Wood Garment Mountain, and learned about many interesting things regarding the Northern Complete Reed Continent from the Immortal reports that he had asked people to bring over for him. The biggest surprise of all was naturally Taoist nun Huang Ting from Peace and Tranquility Mountain, and she had lost to the young prodigy called Lu Jinglong in an intense battle on Temper Mountain. One had to realize that Huang Ting had traveled to the Northern Complete Reed Continent for the purpose of breaking through the barrier of the nascent tier. Even though Huang Ting was only a new nascent tier cultivator, the lofty height of her sword skills was unquestionable. Meanwhile, there were two so-called young cultivators who possessed even better cultivation bases, aptitudes and fortunes than Lu Jinglong, someone who was roughly the same age and at the same cultivation base as Huang Ting. As for the 7 prodigies who were ranked after Lu Jinglong on the list of top 10 young prodigies, Jian Lai didn't dare to underestimate them at all when taking into account the temperament and abilities of the lofty Cloud Palace's Yang Ningxing. Apart from these matters, there was also one place on Temper Mountain that Jian Ping'an was very curious about. There was always a taller mountain, and close to Temper Mountain, which was always raging with battles, was 100 Springs Mountain, a place that was most suitable for spectating battles. There were more than 100 spirit springs on the mountain, making 100 Springs Mountain an innate treasured land that was filled with abundant spiritual energy. There were 1,000 or so immortal residences of varying sizes on the mountain, tucked away amid the green mountains, blue waters, serene environments, and beautiful sceneries. These residences had all been meticulously constructed by Mahis craftsmen at locations carefully chosen by esteemed naturalist cultivators, and they were top-notch cultivation abodes that were only rented and not up for sale. The Jade Forest sect, the owner of these immortal residences, allowed cultivators to rent these immortal abodes for long periods of time, but the longer the rent period, the higher the rent price. Relying on this long-term business strategy, the Jade Forest sect was able to earn an impressive amount of money and brute force a guest elder to the unpolished Jade tier, albeit mediocre, allowing them to become a sect-level force. The Jade Forest sect had never enjoyed a good reputation in the northern complete reed continent, and this was because they valued money above all else. They never valued their relationships, and they only cared about making more and more money. Because of this, cultivators both envied and looked down on the Jade Forest sect. There was a popular and derisive saying that had spread throughout the continent reading, "An upper 5-tier cultivator who's useless, a sect with pure wind in its sleeves." Jian Ping'an put down his chopsticks and looked toward the city gate. There was the sound of thundering hooves pounding across the earth in the distance, and it was most likely a formation with 8 tall and majestic horses galloping out of the city together. These horses didn't slow down when they reached the bustling city gate, and their riders actually whipped them and commanded them to go faster instead. This caused commotion and chaos at the city gate, with the commoners entering Imperial accompanying city hurriedly running to the walls to dodge the charging horses. However, they seemed completely unsurprised by this, and the man also hurriedly but calmly shuffled to the wall with his ox-drawn cart. A wide path was instantly formed for the 8 galloping horses. This was something that happened everywhere. The profligate disciples with extravagant clothes and fearsome horses sat high atop their steeds as they burst out of the city, with the thundering hooves of the horses sounding like the endless explosion of firecrackers. There was arrogance and haughtiness on the faces of the wealthy profligate disciples, and they appeared calm and adept as they rushed past the large crowd of commoners. They were all dressed in expensive mink fur coats, holding brocade whips, and armed with curved sabers and bows. There were even esteemed servants accompanying them and carrying an eagle cage. It was as if they were chasing the wind and pursuing the lightning, appearing as mighty as could be. However, Jian Ping'an's attention was focused more on 2 young people who were sitting at a stall in the distance, one male and one female. They were dressed simply and cleanly, and both carrying long swords on their backs. Their appearances weren't extraordinary, but they possessed a naturally impressive presence. They were both eating a bowl of wontons with apathetic expressions, but the young man immediately furrowed his brows when he saw the group of profligate disciples charging out of the city on their horses. However, the young woman put down her chopsticks and shook her head at the young man. Jian Ping'an nodded in understanding when he saw this. They were most likely cultivators who had come here after noticing the black mist shrouding Imperial accompanying city. However, neither of them had high cultivation basis, and judging by the subtle details of their spiritual energy circulation, they were chi refiners who had yet to advance to the abode tier. They were both carrying swords on their backs, but they definitely weren't legitimate sword cultivators. When the young woman looked over, she saw a young man paying a stall owner for his food. He was holding a bamboo hat and a bamboo hiking pole in his hand, and his expression was calm and his aura was mediocre, making him appear no different to the adventurers who wandered around the cultivation world. The young woman sighed upon seeing this. If this person was an adventurer who had inadvertently wandered to Imperial accompanying city, then it could only be said that he was very unfortunate. On the other hand, if he had especially come to Imperial accompanying city because of the impending calamity and the accompanying treasures that would appear just like they had, then he was truly naive and impudent. After all, did he not know that this peculiar treasure had already been internally assigned an owner by the 2 powerful immortal forces of the Silver Screen Nation? Who dared to covet this treasure? She and her junior brother certainly didn't. and they were only here to complete a secret mission assigned by their master. They were treating this as a training exercise filled with hidden dangers. This was a genuine fight between immortals, and mortals would be ruthlessly pounded into smithereens if they dared to get involved and accidentally blocked the path of some powerful immortal. The young woman sat there and contemplated some matters. She could already be regarded as a young prodigy in the Silver Screen Nation and the surrounding nations, but compared to those two people, she knew that she was still very much inferior. One was a young boy at just 15 years of age, yet he had already advanced to the abode tier 2 years ago. The other was a young woman at 20 years of age, and she had further enjoyed endless fortunes and a smooth journey of cultivation, also possessing an incredibly valuable treasure. If it weren't for the fact that they hailed from two opposing top-notch immortal sects that were arch-enemies with each other, they would have been the perfect pair of golden boy and jade girl. There were a dozen or so nations in the region, and it appeared as if everyone in the mountains and outside the mountains were watching them grow and compete. Each meeting between them would result in an exciting story that everyone discussed with relish. In reality, the young woman was very envious of these two young prodigies. This was because the intelligent young boy who was destined for fame since childhood indeed looked like an otherworldly immortal. His personality was warm and gentle, and he was exceptionally skilled at instruments, writing and painting. She couldn't fathom how there could exist such a captivating young boy in the world. Seeing his senior sister become adrift as she sat there, the young man thought that she was worried about their mission afterward, so he said in consolation, "Senior sister, if we're not confident about completing the mission, then we can leave after we find that child. There's no need to worry about this unavoidable calamity." Master also said that cultivators like us need to understand fate and act according to the trend. Since Imperial Accompanying City has already enjoyed the fortune of being protected by a deity for several hundred years, it's only right that they suffer this significant destined calamity. The young woman nodded in response before warning, "Be careful of eavesdroppers." The young man smiled and said, "I do believe that there are all kinds of people in the prefectural city, including strong and mysterious people. However, to say that we'll come across powerful beings at the city gate? I don't believe this. We're not from some small third-rate immortal force either. So which old immortal or young immortal from the mountains do we not recognize? Perhaps that person who's mucking around with a monkey is an immortal concealing his aura? Or perhaps that young wanderer wearing a bamboo hat is actually a superior grandmaster from the cultivation world." The young woman's expression changed slightly and she scolded, "Have you forgotten the teachings of our master? We need to speak carefully and act carefully when we leave the mountains and travel around outside." As she said this, she quickly glanced at the old man with the monkey squatting on his shoulder, as well as the young man who had walked over to an ox-drawn cart. There was nothing to worry about regarding the latter, with the young man completely oblivious to her junior brother's offensive remarks. However, her heart shuddered when she looked at the former, and this was because the old man who had been feeding the small monkey on his shoulder just then also turned around to look at her, pursing his lips with an unfriendly expression. The young woman stood up and cupped her fists in apology. However, the old man wasn't very understanding, and his gaze wandered around as he looked her up and down from head to toe. He then smiled coldly and retracted his gaze, seemingly uninterested in her looks and figure. The young woman didn't care too much about this, but a ball of flaming fury instantly welled up inside her junior brother's chest. This old bastard actually dared to humiliate his senior sister. He was just about to step forward, but his senior sister gently grabbed his sleeve and shook her head at him, saying, "We were in the wrong first." The young man shot a furious glare at the old man with the monkey on his shoulder, making sure to commit his appearance to memory. When they entered Imperial Accompanying City afterward, the numerous forces would definitely end up with chaotic relationships with one another as conflict broke out. As such, he would definitely give this old bastard hell once he found a suitable opportunity to make a move. Chan Ping'an was actually observing everything, and he couldn't help but sigh with emotion upon seeing the two parties mysteriously build animosity with each other. Their tempers were truly quite bad. In reality, the Silver Screen Nation and the surrounding dozen or so nations all suffered from a lack of spiritual energy, making them unsuitable locations for cultivation. As a result, these nations were rife with martial artists from the cultivation world, And the Spring Dew Garden Song Lanxiao had also commented that the qi refiners in these nations were like a group of frogs at the bottom of the well. These qi refiners liked to lie inside their small ponds and act arrogantly there. And they were happy about the lack of powerful figures from outside, as this would give them free rein to act as they pleased. With the two opposing forces both led by golden core tier immortals with terrible cultivation foundations, they liked to frequently gather together groups of underlings to taunt and fight each other. This had already been going on for several hundred years. However, even though Song Lanxiao had spoken casually, Qian Pingyan was still accustomed to acting carefully when he traveled around the cultivation world. Caution was the key to longevity, after all. Google search innovu1fire.net. Cultivators in the mountains were skilled at all sorts of weird and wonderful immortal techniques, so once conflict broke out, the level of one's cultivation base and even the grade of one's immortal treasures weren't necessarily accurate indications of who would come out on top. The circulation of fortune and the effects of schemes were all factors that could affect the results. After entering the prefectural city, Qian Pingyan didn't continue to follow the sturdy man and his two children to the market near the fire god shrine, lest the man suspect that he harbored ill intentions. Instead, Qian Pingyan made his way to the city god temple first. In reality, Qian Pingyan could tell that the sturdy man was actually a pure martial artist at around the 4th tier, and it was only after Qian Pingyan had approached him that he had purposely muddied his breathing and caused his walking to become choppy. According to Qian Pingyan's understanding, a 3rd-tier martial artist with a decent cultivation foundation should have enjoyed some minor fame in the cultivation world of the Silver Screen Nation. So as for why this man had become a woodsman in the countryside selling firewood to the city to make a living and causing his family to also suffer as a result, it was very likely that he had his own story and reasons. Qian Pingyan wouldn't probe into these personal matters, especially since he didn't know the man well enough. After they parted ways, the sturdy man walked forward with the ox-drawn cart, and his two young children remained as carefree as always as they looked around at the surroundings. The man smiled and glanced back at the young wanderer disappearing into the distance, murmuring to himself, "He couldn't even tell that I was a member of the cultivation world, so he's probably just a junior at the 2nd tier or the 3rd tier. Sai, why is he coming here to involve himself in this mess?" Those immortals from the mountains are like powerful flood dragons when they unleash their immortal techniques, with a casual wave of their arms being strong enough to end the lives of countless commoners in the city. Qian Pingyan smiled when he heard this. The sturdy man was a kind-hearted person, and he had purposely told Qian Pingyan that the Spirit Treasure City in the north was also worth visiting. This was presumably so that Qian Pingyan would leave this dangerous prefectural city sooner rather than later. By a stroke of coincidence, the old man carrying a monkey on his shoulder and the young man and young woman carrying swords on their backs were also heading in the same direction as Qian Pingyan, making their way to the city god temple first. Qian Pingyan purposely walked slowly to increase the distance between himself and the 3 cultivators, and he then stopped at a calligraphy and painting shop along the way and looked at the works inside for around 15 minutes. He didn't purchase any calligraphy works, but he did spend a few taels of silver to purchase a few books that the shop usually gave away as gifts for purchases. These books especially introduced the famous works of the calligraphy masters of each dynasty and generation, and even though the books were relatively high quality, they couldn't be regarded as rare or valuable. It was simply that their contents were quite interesting. Qian Pingyan left the shop after putting the books into his bamboo case, and the old man and the 2 young cultivators were already nowhere to be seen. Qian Pingyan's expression became slightly solemn as he approached the city god temple. There were wisps of incense smoke rising into the sky, and one could smell the unique fragrance of the incense smoke even from the streets outside the city god temple. However, if one had visited many temples and shrines of deities before, then one would understand that the amount of incense offerings wasn't the most important thing. Rather, what was important was the purity of the incense offerings and how many kilograms of incense essence could be collected. This was the same for both official temples recognized by the imperial court and illegal temples constructed by commoners or spirits. When Qian Pingyan focused his gaze and observed the city god temple, what he saw was incense smoke lingering around the large and majestic temple, as if the city god had used some secret technique to confine them and prevent them from seeping out. This could be regarded as an audacious move given that all of the temples and shrines officially recognized by the imperial court, including mountain god temples, water god temples, city god temples, martial sage temples, and scholarly temples, were required to feed some of the incense offerings back to the local mountains and rivers. A certain portion of incense essence would be dispersed into the surrounding area, thereby benefiting the world and protecting the local residents. It was only then that a positive cycle could be created and maintained. This was in stark contrast to the situation that Chen Ping'an was currently observing, with the city god temple claiming everything and preventing a single drop of incense essence from leaving his territory. Chen Ping'an heaved a soft sigh. In reality, he could understand why this was happening, and it was simply a case of the city god disregarding all other matters in an attempt to save his godly body. This was analogous to drinking poison to quench thirst, a short-term solution that would only cause bigger problems in the future. Chen Ping'an didn't enter the city god temple that was responsible for protecting the prefectural city. The sturdy man selling firewood had explained things very clearly just then, but he was ultimately someone who had come here to pray in a sincere manner before. As such, Chen Ping'an had a rough understanding of the deities who were honored in the front hall and the back hall of the temple. The rules of the city god temple in Imperial Accompanying City were fairly similar to that of other cities, and apart from the front hall, the back hall, and the star deity pagoda, there was also a god of wealth hall, the Yuanshan hall, and other halls constructed according to the architectural styles of the local area. Even so, Chen Ping'an still visited an incense shop near the city god temple and asked the old shopkeeper in detail about the situation. The old shopkeeper was a talkative person, and he happily explained the history of the city god temple to Chen Ping'an. As it turned out, the deity honored in the front hall was an ancient general from 1,000 years ago, someone who had provided meritorious service to an empire and was praised in the history books. However, the godly body of this heroic spirit was naturally enshrined somewhere else. Meanwhile, the actual city god responsible for controlling fortune and calamity, and patrolling the Yin world and the Yang world was a renowned scholarly official who was honored in the back hall. He was an official of the Silver Screen Nation whom the emperor had bestowed the title of third-rank feudal lord. After saying this, the old shopkeeper smiled and asked, "Young lad, are you unable to figure out why he was only bestowed the title of third-rank feudal lord? After all, this scholarly official had been a second-rank head minister when he was still alive." Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "I am indeed slightly puzzled, and I was just about to ask Mr. Shopkeeper about this. Is there a reason for this? If this pertained to the rules and practices of the many temples and shrines in the majestic world, then Chen Ping'an was actually well aware of everything already. However, if he wanted to adapt to the local traditions and customs, then he naturally had to understand these traditions and customs first." The old shopkeeper smiled and didn't say anything. Chen Ping'an hurriedly asked the old shopkeeper for a tube of incense. He was quite quick to catch on. The old shopkeeper laughed heartily and finally started to reveal some secrets, saying, "Young lad, it's clear that you're someone who travels around the cultivation world, so it's very normal for you to not understand matters regarding the imperial court. Noble ranks and official ranks are slightly different, and the ranks of esteemed deities who enjoy incense offerings are different yet again. How is it? Are you confused yet?" Chen Ping'an nodded and replied with a smile, "It is indeed a bit complicated." The old shopkeeper started to show off his knowledge, bobbing his head around as he explained. The city god of this prefectural city was initially only bestowed the title of fourth-rank feudal lord by the founding emperor of the Silver Screen Nation. However, praying at this city god temple was always very efficacious, so when the new emperor ascended the throne a few years ago, he issued another edict and promoted our city god to the position of third-rank feudal lord. It was a grand event at the time, and the head minister of the Ministry of Rights, such a high-ranking official, personally left the capital to visit Imperial Accompanying City with the imperial edict. After entering the city, he chose a bright and auspicious day and had his subordinates and servants clean the street all the way from the beginning to the end. Yes, do you see that street behind the stall there? However, outsiders weren't allowed to watch this, and it was only because I decided to sleep in my shop the night before to catch a glimpse of the grand event that I was able to catch sight of the lofty head minister. TSK, as expected of the once-you star descending into the mortal world. When even taking a glance from far away, I could tell that he was noble and lofty. There was a proud expression on the old shopkeeper's face as he continued, "Our city might only be a prefectural city, but the treatment that our city god enjoys is already on the same level as the city gods of provincial cities. Apart from the city gods in the capital and the secondary capital, No other city god enjoys a bestowed title as lofty as our city god. So, young lad, you definitely need to pray more sincerely and kowtow a few more times in the city god temple now that you've obtained a tube of incense. Even though the city god temple has always been more efficacious for scholars praying for literary fortune, our city god is high-ranking and capable, so I surmise that he'll also look after you as long as you're sincere enough. Chen Ping'an asked a few more questions about the subordinate literary officials in the city god temple, and sure enough, they were magistrate judges as expected. There were 6 departments in city god temples, as well as 2 day and night wandering deities and 1 shackle and chain general. These subordinate officials who served the city god also had their own origins and histories that the old shopkeeper was extremely familiar with, and he was able to describe everything logically and clearly as he explained these matters to Chen Ping'an. However, the old shopkeeper was rendered speechless when Chen Ping'an asked about whether he had seen the divine manifestation of the city god before. His expression was slightly unnatural, and he replied that commoners like them obviously wouldn't be able to see the true body of the city god. In fact, they wouldn't be able to recognize the city god even if he were standing right in front of them. Hearing this, Chen Ping'an smiled and said, "This is completely reasonable and expected. As the saying goes, true immortals don't carelessly show off their powers, and those who carelessly show off their powers aren't true immortals. I assume that the same is also true for deities." The expression of the old shopkeeper improved slightly when he heard this. The etiquette pertaining to city gods of the Silver Screen Nation was largely similar to that of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, but there were still some small differences, for example, regarding the official grades and accompanying officials. However, the current emperor of the Silver Screen Nation promoting the city god to a higher grade was quite abnormal, and the reason for doing so was most likely because the emperor had noticed the unusual state of the city god's godly body. As such, the emperor had been willing to go as far as to promote the city god to a higher position than was reasonable. After leaving the incense shop, Chen Ping'an stood on the bustling street and glanced at the city god temple. It was preferable to sleep at a desolate graveyard rather than at an abandoned temple. This was the reason behind this saying. Once the spiritual energy of the mountains and rivers turned, it was very easy for fortune to transform into misfortune. The canal master's expression was adrift as she looked toward the back wall of the shrine, and she shook her head slightly before saying with a sullen expression and a quivering voice, "Esteemed immortal, did you truly just kill, do you?" Chen Ping'an thought for a moment before replying with a smile. "He's half dead, and I've imprisoned his soul. The Ghost Axe Palace is a large immortal force, and Duyu's parents are also powerful Dao partners in the mountains according to you. That being the case, how can I dare to disrespect Duyu? I'm simply giving him some minor punishment." The canal master was unable to stand still, and she surprisingly collapsed to the ground on her backside, with her colorful embroidered dress appearing like a dazzling peony blooming on the ground. The young man standing in front of her had a sweet tongue, but his heart and mind were actually crawling with venomous snakes and scorpions. Even though he looked young, he was definitely an old monster who had already been cultivating in the mountains for countless years. He was a lofty immortal who acted viciously and ruthlessly with a kindly smile on his face. Chen Ping'an flicked his sleeves, causing the dust on his clothes to immediately disperse into the surroundings and his azure robe to become spotless again. He directly walked through the split in the divine altar, and as he walked past the young man who was playing dead beside the campfire, he smiled and said, "Hurry up and wipe away your drool. Then continue to play dead." The young man hurriedly obeyed his instructions. Chen Ping'an sat on the door threshold of the shrine and looked at the canal master and her 2 maidservants as he grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and took a swig of energy water from the deep stream of Treasure Mirror Mountain. There was once a city god called Shun One in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, a water goddess of the Burial River in the Parasol Leaf Continent, the canal master, the lake lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake, and the city god of Imperial Accompanying City in the Northern Complete Reed Continent. Chen Ping'an had indeed used a secret mystical ability to imprison Duyu's soul, and he hadn't been making things up to purposely frighten the female canal master. Chen Ping'an wouldn't dare to use an internal observation technique to travel to his water palace in the short term. He was afraid to see the aggrieved and indignant expressions of the little children in green. Chen Ping'an retrieved a snow-white militarian armor pellet from his sleeve, as well as a vermilion alchemical pill that had a dense array of talismanic symbols inscribed on its surface. This was what the Ghost Axe Palace's you had wanted to do just then. Launch a sneak attack on Qian Ping'an using these treasures. The alchemical pill was refined from the internal core of a demon, and its effects were similar to those used by the assassins who had surrounded Mao Xiaodong in the capital of the Great Sui nation back then. However, those alchemical pills had been refined from legitimate golden cores, while the alchemical pill in Qian Ping'an's hand right now was far inferior. This alchemical pill was most likely refined from the internal core of a sea observation tier demon. As for the Militarian armor pellet, it was clear that Du hadn't wanted to suffer severe wounds along with his opponent, so he had wanted to use this divine dew-bearing armor to block the destructive power of the exploding alchemical pill. Du Yu's plan had been very good. Qian Ping'an had indeed felt slightly uneasy when hearing about the tragic events that had taken place in Imperial accompanying city in the past, but he had still kept an eye on Du Yu as well as the expressions of the two maidservants. However, Qian Ping'an had become slightly adrift for a moment, and Du Yu had seized this opportunity to make a move. Unfortunately for him, the subtle ripple of his aura had caused some crushed rocks near the wall to send up a very small cloud of dust. The Canal Master might have failed to detect this, but to Qian Ping'an, whose fist intent was free-flowing like water as if he were being assisted by a deity, the small cloud of dust had been like rumbling thunder. After all, only the fists of the 10th-tier martial artist in Downtrodden Mountain's bamboo building were truly silent until they exploded like thunder. Because of this, there were many times when Qian Ping'an would need to guess or gamble to avoid being hit too hard. It was impossible to block Cui Cheng's fists, even if he suppressed his fist intent to the far-roaming tier. Moreover, even when Qian Ping'an had been training with martial arts maniac Zhu Lian, Cui Cheng had forced the hunchbacked old man to beat Qian Ping'an half dead. As such, his fist attacks had been extremely wild and chaotic. To put things simply, Du Yu's cultivation base was still very lacking. This was similar to how Qian Ping'an's treasure had been coveted by malicious Ghost Valley's Gao Cheng back then, so his only option had been to flee without any hesitation. If Du Yu hadn't attempted to turn the tables and had chosen to directly flee after regaining consciousness, Qian Ping'an would have still blocked him from escaping anyway. However, Qian Ping'an definitely wouldn't have gone as far as to kill him and imprison his soul. Qian Ping'an put the vermilion alchemical pill, one of Du Yu's life-saving trump cards, inside his sleeve. He held the snow-white armor pellet in his hand and slowly rolled it around, looking toward the Canal Master and saying, "I said before that you should tell me everything that you know. You also said that you wouldn't actively seek death anymore." Still sitting on the ground, there was an expression of deep grief on the Canal Master's face as she said in tragic misery, "Esteemed immortal, I'm genuinely not hiding anything from you. Perhaps you'll only be happy once you unjustly kill me." She threw her body to the ground and rested her face on her arms, lying down and refusing to stand up as she trembled in a pitiful manner and sobbed. "Just what sin did I commit to be unjustly treated by esteemed immortal?" Qian Ping'an stood up, causing the Canal Master to immediately fall silent. In the next moment, Qian Ping'an squatted down beside the Canal Master and placed a hand on her head, pushing down forcefully and making her suffer a similar fate to Du Yu. She was knocked unconscious with half of her head embedded in the ground. The two maidservants were terrified, and they immediately turned around to flee. However, Qian Ping'an flicked his sleeve and struck one of them in the back with his astral energy, causing her slender body to slam into the wall and render her unconscious. Only a trembling maidservant remained conscious, and it was as if she had been frozen still by an immortal technique after taking just a single step. She didn't dare to move at all. Qian Ping'an turned around and sat on the steps, saying, "You're a bit more honest than your sister who has failed to master the skill of smashing through walls." The expressions in your eyes revealed a lot of information to me when the Canal Master was explaining some details just then. So why don't you repeat the explanations to me and treat this as an exercise in filling in the gaps for your master? Regardless of whether you believe me or not, I'll repeat this one more time. There's no bad blood between me and the three of you, and killing the water deity of an area will cause me to attract karmic fate even if the water deity is only a follower or a subordinate. The maidservant wasn't stupid, and she said through sobs, "Lady Canal Master respectfully referred to young master as great esteemed immortal just then, but why do I feel like young master appears more like a pure martial artist?" Do you also said that young master is a martial arts grandmaster just then? Martial artists won't attract karmic fate when they kill deities. Qian Ping'an chuckled in speechlessness and patted his sword nurturing gourd, causing 15th to fly out and circle in the air like a sparrow flying around a tree. In the darkness of night, a streak of green sword light rapidly dashed around Qian Ping'an. The maidservant was astounded and she exclaimed, "Sure enough, young master is actually a sword immortal." It was said that the paramount lake lord of verdant bamboo lake was most afraid of these sword immortals who could behead people with their flying swords. "If you say so," Qian Ping'an smiled and said. The maidservant was extremely hesitant, and the look of pain and grief on her face was completely different from the look of immense pity on the canal master's face just then. These were her true feelings. If she revealed the secrets tonight, then judging by the canal master's fondness for being suspicious and the lake lord's violent temperament, would she not suffer the fate of death when she returned? Casting one's gaze over the one lake, 3 rivers, and 2 canals that were ruled over by the lake lord, there were so many of her sisters who had suffered the fate of having their souls being dragged out and transformed into burning water lamps because of some trivial matters that had angered the lake lord. In fact, there were more victims than she could count on 2 hands. Only when the water lamps burned up the final drop of essence soul oil would the souls of her sisters be freed from the sea of agony. However, they would also be stripped of the ability to reincarnate. Qian Ping'an had initially wanted to mention some related matters and subtly reveal some of his plans for afterward in order to make her feel more comfortable, but he ultimately said just a single word, "Speak." The maidservant shuddered in fright, no longer daring to think that she could get off without speaking the truth. She blurted out everything that she knew, including her own speculations of what had taken place. She revealed everything to the young sword immortal. The lake lord of verdant bamboo lake was one of the few high-ranking water gods of the Silver Screen Nation, and he could enjoy an equal standing even when he met with the several formal gods of the mountains. As such, he had always looked down on the city god temple of Imperial Accompanying City, and he especially looked down on the deity honored in the fire god shrine. This deity had once had a disagreement with the canal master and fought with her, and the lake lord had almost threatened to unleash the lake water to drown Imperial Accompanying City, wanting to force the deity of the fire god shrine to step forward and kowtow in apology in front of the entire prefectural city. Afterward, it was a white-haired sword immortal who had been passing through the area who had mediated the situation and calmed both parties down, resolving the conflict between them. However, the lake lord's resentment toward Imperial Accompanying City had grown even stronger. When the prefectural overseer sent a secret letter to his good friend in the capital, the city god temple had been completely oblivious to the matter, but the lake lord had seen everything very clearly. The lake lord had secretly instructed the canal master of Algae Stream to stop the messenger, and after learning of the contents of the letter, he had handed the canal master a jade seal that could allow deities to leave their jurisdiction and venture far away. The lake lord had ordered the female canal master of Algae Stream to accompany the messenger to the capital of the Silver Screen Nation. Upon hearing this, Qian Ping'an asked, "How is the relationship between the fire god shrine and the city god temple?" "Their relationship is quite ordinary," the maidservant replied. "The fire god shrine is theoretically a slightly lower grade than the city god temple, but the deity of the shrine isn't very fond of interacting with the city god temple. Because of this, the fire god and the city god almost never appear together at the banquets held by the immortal forces in the mountains." "And what's the lake lord's attitude toward the city god temple?" Qian Ping'an asked. "The lake lord holds the city god in very low regard, and when Lady Canal Master occasionally gets drunk at the Dragon Palace at the bottom of the lake, she'll reveal some of her conversations to me and my sister when she returns to the private residence," the maidservant replied in a soft voice. She said that the lake lord jokes about the city god being a bumpkin who loved to plagiarize the poems of relatively unknown scholars and literati when he was alive. He would then spend huge amounts of money to build his fame and reputation. Even though the Silver Screen Nation has appointed him as a city god, he's someone who only cares about his fame and reputation, and has no talent in governance. He spends his time composing poems and enjoying scenery, and he refers to himself as the moon-appreciating spiritual master. He also likes to delegate his work to other people, but he has no talent in managing his subordinates, so the current calamity befalling Imperial Accompanying City isn't a natural disaster at all. Rather, it's clearly a man-made disaster. Despite all of this, verdant bamboo lake and the city god temple have a neutral relationship on the surface, and the city god often brings royals, officials, and nobles sightseeing outside the capital to the dragon palace at the bottom of the lake to broaden their horizons. There are a dozen or so beautiful maidservants in the residence at the bottom of the lake, and all of them are extremely seductive and charming, allowing the esteemed guests to arrive with high spirits and depart with complete satisfaction. The city god temple has committed wrongdoings again and again, leading to the huge calamity today, Chen Ping'an said. The fire god shrine will naturally be affected as well, so I dare say that the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake is actually happy to see this happen. The maidservant fell silent for a moment, after which she smiled bitterly and said, "The Lake Lord is the paramount water deity of the nation, so how can a lowly maidservant like me guess the profound thoughts in his mind?" Chen Ping'an nodded in response and put the armor pellet back inside his sleeve. He then gently flicked a finger and caused the maidservant to fall backward to the ground, unconscious. After doing this, he waved his sleeve and summoned the maidservant who was embedded in the wall. She flew over as if she were being dragged by someone, and she eventually tumbled along the ground and slowly regained consciousness. She had a splitting headache, and it was as if her entire body were about to fall apart. The measly maidservant had scrambled eggs for brains, and I wasn't able to extract any useful information from her at all. You look a bit smarter, so why don't you explain the situation to me? Chen Ping'an asked. The maidservant wanted to fall to her knees and kowtow to beg for her life, but Chen Ping'an flicked his finger with relatively minimal force. Even so, the maidservant was still sent flying backward like a broken kite, directly flying out of the entrance of the water immortal shrine. Chen Ping'an reached forward and made a grabbing motion, dragging her back before holding her up by the neck. He looked into her eyes, and the maidservant was utterly petrified when she locked gazes with Chen Ping'an. Her face became purple, and she started to whimper as if she had something to say. Chen Ping'an casually tossed her to the courtyard ground, and the maidservant collapsed in a heap before taking a deep breath and standing up. She turned around to look at the canal master, and there was a complicated look of gratitude, attachment, and displeasure in her eyes. Discover more novels at novelafire.net. In the end, she put on a stern expression and viciously spat at the young immortal who was purposely acting mysterious, saying with a cold chuckle, "I've finished my explanation." Chen Ping'an simply extended a hand to swat away the spit, with his expression calm as he sat down on the steps and gently put down his verdant green hiking pole. Chen Ping'an flicked his finger again and knocked the second maidservant unconscious. Algae Stream, a large and turquoise canal, was filled with watergrass that swayed with the undulating water. It was as if water ghosts were waving at the passers-by. There were many supernatural stories and literary records about water ghosts, seeking living people to replace them in death, with most of these stories using revenge as the main theme. However, once there was a barrier between yin and yang and a barrier between life and death, it naturally wouldn't be so easy for ordinary water ghosts to obtain freedom from their suffering and find a living person to replace them. Ordinary water ghosts weren't powerful cultivators skilled in a myriad of immortal techniques, after all. As such, it was indeed true that ghosts from the yin world harmed people, but it was largely false that they were doing so for freedom and liberation. This misconception was born from the falsehoods being continuously spread by scholars, literati, and storytellers. After leaving the water goddess shrine, Chen Ping'an dragged the unconscious canal master of Algae Stream behind him as he made his way to Verdant Bamboo Lake. Diyu was still wearing his suit of divine dew-bearing armor as he flew on the wind and followed Chen Ping'an, mustering his courage to also visit Verdant Bamboo Lake. Perhaps it was because Diyu had already interacted with Chen Ping'an for a long time and been influenced by his behavior. He became increasingly thoughtful and meticulous as he asked about whether or not he should remove his relatively eye-catching divine dew-bearing armor, lest his mighty senior be detected too early and lose the advantageous element of surprise. Chen Ping'an replied that there was no need. This allowed Diyu to feel slightly more at ease. However, what Chen Ping'an said next caused Diyu's heart to immediately jump into his throat. The mighty senior said slowly, "There might be a huge battle after we arrive on the bank of Verdant Bamboo Lake, but you don't need to do anything at that time, and you can simply treat it as another gamble between life and death. You can pretend to be deaf and mute as you stand on the sidelines. In any case, the situation can only become so bad from your perspective, and you might even be able to make some small profits. Chen Ping'an merely smiled and offered no response. Yu glanced at the canal master and felt as if he were living a different life. He couldn't help but sigh with emotion. His parents had always said that lofty cultivators possessed profound Tao power. However, cultivators with clear backgrounds and immortal forces would always act in relatively predictable manners and be easier to negotiate with. For example, the city lord of Yellow Axe City and the old ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. As such, these cultivators weren't necessarily frightening. However, what was frightening was the unpredictability and impermanence that existed in the world. It was because of these notions that people couldn't predict and understand everything. Yu hadn't liked listening to these things in the past, and he had treated these lofty and intangible principles as wind passing by his ears. As such, he felt like tonight's trip around the jurisdiction of Verdant Bamboo Lake was more frightening and heart-stopping than the sum of his previous trips through the cultivation world. Yu gave up on thinking too much at this moment, and he definitely didn't ask the mighty senior about his intentions either. He would simply treat his explanations as the truth and abide by his instructions. In any case, the schemes of those at the pinnacle of the mountains were far beyond his ability to understand and comprehend. Instead of making blind guesses, he was better off leaving everything to fate. There was one good thing about this mysterious senior from some outside place. He was direct and authentic. Because of this, Yu decided to go all out and answer all of the questions that were put to him, speaking from the bottom of his heart. Rather than playing stupid or trying to have a battle of wits with this mighty senior, it was better for him to speak and act more honestly. In any case, he surmised that the mighty senior had seen through his character and personality a long time ago. As if recalling something, Chen Ping'an suddenly stopped in his tracks and threw the canal master to the ground. However, he didn't smack her awake. Yu's mind was wandering at some faraway place, so he accidentally overshot the mighty immortal in azure by a few dozen meters. He hurriedly flew back and scanned the surroundings, placing his hand on the hilt of his saber and asking, "Is there a trap ahead, senior? Should I head over to scout the situation first?" Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, "The Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake and the old ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm possess profound cultivation bases, so do they need to stoop to the level of setting up traps for you and me? They simply need to station their subordinates on the bank of the lake, and just taking a single glance at them will be enough to send an ice-cold chill down your spine." After saying this, Chen Ping'an asked Yu, "There aren't that many cultivators in the Silver Screen Nation and the dozen or so surrounding nations, so has no one ever thought about venturing further out to explore other places? For example, Skeleton Shoal in the southern region and the Great Origin Empire in the central region?" Yu shook his head and replied, "I'm not sure about the cultivators from the other immortal forces, but focusing on just the Ghost Axe Palace alone, we're told of an ancestral rule from the first day that we set foot on the path of cultivation. The gist of this ancestral rule is that disciples of future generations shouldn't embark on distant journeys for no good reason, and they should instead focus on staying put and cultivating in peace. My parents often tell their disciples that the spiritual energy of heaven and earth is most abundant in our region, making it a rare cultivation paradise of the world. As such, we'll be inviting trouble if we expose ourselves to the impoverished cultivators of the outside world. They'll naturally end up feeling jealous and coveting our lands. However, I don't really buy this explanation, and it's because of this that I've traveled around the cultivation world for so many years. In reality, Yu paused in slight hesitation after saying this. You've already answered my question honestly, so you don't have to say the rest if you don't want to. I'm not especially interested in your crappy experiences in the cultivation world, Chen Ping'an said. Yu immediately understood the situation, and he shuffled closer to the mighty senior before lowering his voice and saying, "This is a very strange matter. My parents do pamper me slightly, but they still keep their lips tightly sealed whenever I mention this matter. They simply respond by saying that ignorance is bliss when it comes to certain matters. I naturally didn't dare to oppose my parents, so I came up with a compromise by using my travels through the cultivation world as an excuse to venture slightly further out. I stopped right at the acceptable limit each time, and after traveling around everywhere, I was genuinely able to discover some clues and get a taste of things." Chen Ping'an smiled and remarked, "It seems like you got a taste of many things in the cultivation world, didn't you?" Du chuckled and replied, "My childish endeavors can't compare to senior flying on the wind to travel between continents, enjoying a free and unfettered great Tao and traveling across the myriad mountains and rivers in a single step." After saying these words of flattery, Du continued, "In the end, I discovered that there seemingly existed a formless barrier on the outside border of the dozen or so nations. The spiritual energy near this border was extremely thin, and it was as if some immortal from the pinnacle of the mountains and living in the lofty sea of clouds had drawn a circle around these mortal territories. This is a barrier that can both protect us and prevent outside cultivators from barging in to cause us harm. People don't dare to overstep this boundary in the least." Something similar to Cui Dongshan drawing a thunder pool with his flying sword? For what purpose? Chen Ping'an murmured quietly. Chen Ping'an thought about this for a moment, but he was temporarily unable to make heads or tails of the situation. That being the case, he decided to push this matter out of his mind for the moment. However, if this matter were truly related to the rare treasure appearing at Imperial Accompanying City, and if this were a subtle thread stretching across thousands of kilometers, then it was necessary for Chen Ping'an to become increasingly cautious. In other words, even if the talks broke down at Verdant Bamboo Lake afterward, leading to the worst-case scenario playing out, Chen Ping'an couldn't attack his opponents without caring about anything else other than his own satisfaction. He couldn't unleash all of his trump cards for the sake of a gratifying victory. Sword Immortal, the sword on his back, had to remain as a hidden trump card. 15th, his flying sword, had flown out of his sword-nurturing gourd at the Water Immortal Shrine before, so the maidservant there would definitely describe him as a sword immortal. As such, he could use 15th depending on the situation. However, he needed to warn 15th that it was best to fly out of the sword-nurturing gourd slower than normal when it came out to participate in the battle. As for the walnut bracelet in his hand as well as the 3 talismans from the Great Origin Empire's lofty cloud palace, he could pick and choose a few of them to use when he faced some seemingly perilous situations. He could summon them to bathe in the moonlight. As for his martial arts cultivation base and the toughness of his physique, he would suppress them to the peak stage of the 5th tier first. Just then, in the water goddess shrine of Algae Stream's Canal Master, Chen Ping'an had purposely attacked the Canal Master and He Lu in order to mislead his adversaries. He had exposed himself by seemingly attacking with his full strength and not showing any mercy. There were some matters where trying one's best to conceal things wouldn't necessarily be effective. After all, was Chen Ping'an the only person in the world who liked to assume the worst-case scenario all the time? With this in mind, it was better off letting his enemies see the truth with their own eyes. It was important to carefully weigh matters again and again, and it was equally as important to mull over things once, twice, and many more times. Chen Ping'an had traveled by himself through 3 continents, covering tens of thousands of kilometers in the process. These were the principles that he had always abided by during his travels. The only difference now was that he had practiced his fist techniques more, and also owned more treasures and other possessions. At the same time, he had also transformed from a little boy in straw sandals to a young boy dressed in white robes and wearing a jade hairpin, and now to a young man in azure wearing a bamboo hat and holding a hiking pole. Drawing a thunder pool with a flying sword? Du pretended that he hadn't heard anything. He couldn't understand this remark in any case. This was similar to how the mighty senior had casually caused his empty wine pot to vanish into thin air just then. He had most likely placed it inside a minimization treasure, something that his parents always talked about and yearned for. Du had also pretended that he hadn't seen this. Chen Ping'an used his hiking pole to strike the forehead of the Canal Master, waking her up. The Canal Master of Algae Stream was indeed more intelligent and shrewd than the Canal Master of the Water Immortal Shrine, and she remained limp on the ground and showed no signs of standing up as she said in a soft and gentle voice, "It's this maidservant's fault for offending Great Esteemed Immortal. This maidservant will never forget Great Esteemed Immortal's generosity in sparing my life. I plan to kill the Lake Lord and destroy his dragon palace. Now lead the way for me," Chen Ping'an said directly. The exquisitely beautiful and extravagantly dressed Canal Master was unfazed as she asked, "Great Esteemed Immortal, is there a grudge between you and the Lake Lord? Is there some sort of misunderstanding?" Chen Ping'an frowned and snapped, "Enough with the nonsense. Now get up and lead the way." The Canal Master in palatial robes regained some of the refined and regal aura that she had shown in the Water Goddess Shrine, gracefully standing up and curtsying in a charming manner. Unexpectedly, however, the cultivator in azure sent her flying with a single kick. The canal master gritted her teeth and didn't say a single word as she silently stood up. She felt immense hatred for this bastard vagrant cultivator in the depths of her heart, and her resentment was so great that she even developed hatred for Duyu, the extremely unfortunate militarian cultivator from the Ghost Axe Palace as well. However, if she weren't skilled at reading people's emotions and understanding how to respond given the circumstances, she wouldn't have been able to rise up the ranks to become a canal master in the first place. The canal master of Algae Stream had been drowned in a pig cage and become a water ghost, yet she had managed to climb to her current position step by step, and was even able to suppress the canal master of Peony Stream so much that the latter could only abandon her shrine and relocate herself to verdant Bamboo Lake. 1. The canal master of Algae Stream was even able to refer to the 3 subordinate river gods of the Lake Lord as her brothers and sisters, and she hadn't achieved this through her cultivation base or incense offerings or whatnot. She feigned shock and terror as she asked in a quivering voice, "Great esteemed immortal, do you want to swim through the waterways or do you want to fly on the wind?" "We'll walk on foot by the bank," Chen Pingyan replied. The latest authorities are on yellfire.net. The canal master was deeply astonished, but she didn't dare to disobey the instructions of this strange person with a sinister temperament. She could only force herself to slowly walk in front of him. Sure enough, vagrant cultivators of this world were all despicable bastards. When they arrived at the location where Algae Stream converged with verdant Bamboo Lake, that would be the time when this bastard vagrant cultivator had to fall on his knees and kowtow as he begged for his life. Even then, he would still be punished by death and fed to the fish. However, she couldn't help but feel slightly puzzled. Where was celestial maiden Yanqing, who possessed profound Dao power and yellow axe cities? He Lu, who possessed prodigious talent. Why had the golden boy and jade girl suddenly vanished from sight? Sure enough, these so-called immortals from above the clouds were all sanctimonious and cold-hearted in reality. They were nasty pieces of work as well. Meanwhile, Duyu found all of this incredibly interesting. Back then at the water goddess shrine, the canal master of Algae Stream had fallen unconscious and missed out on a good show. If she had witnessed those events, a deity as measly as her wouldn't dare to have any improper thoughts or schemes against the mighty senior at this moment. Chen Pingyan recalled one of the maidservants of Peony Stream's canal master, and he shot a glance at the canal master of Algae Stream before turning to Duyu and commenting, "Brother, Duyu was correct. Sure enough, a person's true character comes out when they're pushed to the brink of death." Duyu hurriedly mustered his courage to call Chen Pingyan brother Chan, after which he replied, "I just randomly made that up on the spot." Chen Pingyan didn't say anything else. Duyu also fell silent as he walked behind Chen Pingyan slowly. As for Chen Pingyan's remark about killing the Lake Lord and destroying the Dragon Palace, Duyu didn't really believe this statement. This wasn't because he doubted this mighty senior's unparalleled power, but rather such kind of behavior would be inconsistent with the mighty senior's business principles. At the Water Immortal Shrine, this mighty senior had directly struck He Lu's neck with a palm strike, causing the latter to directly crash through the roof ridge with no ability to defend himself or counterattack. On the other hand, celestial maiden Yanqing had been able to remain standing until the very end, not being knocked to the ground like He Lu, nor having her head buried in the ground like the canal master of Algae Stream. Was this because the mighty senior had been showing Yanqing mercy due to her beauty? Naturally not. However, Duyu was unable to guess the true reason. For some unknown reason, however, Duyu had a nagging feeling that this profoundly powerful senior would be truly vicious when he did decide to attack beautiful women, regardless of whether they were cultivators or deities. There had been an enraged expression on Lake Lord Inho's face when Chen Pingyan had shattered the golden body of Algae Stream's canal master, as if he were about to unleash a wrathful attack at any moment. In fact, it was as if he might even go as far as to charge ashore. When Chen Pingyan obliterated the godly body of the river god with a single punch, however, the Lake Lord's heart surprisingly became as calm as a tranquil pond, with his expression equally as calm and indifferent. Facing the outsider who was like a lone steed charging a formation by himself, Inho raised a hand and held 2 fingers together, summoning an orb of golden light and an orb of turquoise light that condensed into 2 snake-like wisps that hovered on his fingertips and intertwined with each other. Lake Lord Inho gently flicked his hand, causing mist to rise from the surface of verdant bamboo lake with him as the center. Azure smoke instantly enveloped an area of 300 meters in radius. Over at the dock, to say nothing of Ghost Axe palaces, even Yanqing was unable to see anything but a vast expanse of misty white when she channeled her chi to look over. She was unable to see the Lake Lord and the many scholarly officials and martial officials of the Dragon Palace. Meanwhile, the old ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm had seemingly activated a valuable treasure of the Immortal Force, with a burst of treasure light vaguely visible, and protecting all of the cultivators of the Immortal Force. The cultivators then started to slowly retreat, most likely intending to leave the battlefield and hand everything to Lake Lord Inho to deal with. A faint golden python and a turquoise snake continuously circled around the outskirts of the misty dome, swaying their tails as they soared through the skies and appearing like the descendants of flood dragons that were controlling the clouds and rain and thickening the mist over verdant bamboo lake. Yanqing only knew that this was an innate mystical ability of a water god, who had attained the great Tao. This wasn't simply an illusion technique, and it was instead something similar to a talismanic prison, one which could continuously deplete the spiritual energy inside a chi refiner's acupoints or the true chi of a pure martial artist once they were trapped inside. This was a mystical ability that could be used for both offensive and defensive purposes. Du stood still the entire time, and he took a glance at the obliterated section of the dock in front of him. The structure had completely collapsed, and only the area around the bamboo case and the hiking pole was still untouched and pristine. The mighty senior was truly very impressive. What did this signify? This signified that the mighty senior hadn't used his full strength just then. Yanqing flicked her sleeve and expelled the dust from the dock. However, her eyes remained fixed on the commotion at the surface of verdant bamboo lake the entire time. The mist formation had initially covered an area of 300 meters in radius, yet as if it were a fishing net being dragged up, it instantly shrank in size to just 30 or so meters in radius. However, the mist also became as viscous as water as a result, with the golden python and the turquoise snake surprisingly slithering into the formation from the left and the right. Yanqing sighed in her mind. This was a battle taking place at verdant bamboo lake after all, so Lake Lord Inho clearly enjoyed an overwhelming geographical advantage. At the same time, a trusted river god of his had even been willing to sacrifice his life to obstruct the advance of the young man in azure, causing him to lose his initial advantage. As the battle dragged on, it was likely that his predicament would only become worse and worse. Lake Lord Inho had enjoyed influence and power in the Silver Screen Nation for 1,000 years without falling, and he was even able to stand on equal footing as the formal gods of the Five Mountains as a water god. Taking these matters into account, it was no wonder that the old ancestor had chosen the Dragon Palace of Verdant Bamboo Lake as the final place to stay on their trip to Imperial Accompanying City. Yanqing glanced at Du and saw that he was still calm and unfazed. Du noticed Yanqing's gaze, so he turned his head and commented with a smile, "This measly pond isn't enough to trap Brother Chan, someone who can turn the rivers and upheave the seas with a casual sneeze." Yanqing scoffed upon hearing this. She wondered if he could still utter such repulsive and obsequious words once this intense battle drew to a close. The cultivators of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm had already retreated 300 meters into the distance. Yet old ancestor Fan Weiran still didn't put away the most valuable treasure of the Immortal Force. Golden light radiated from the golden crown on the old woman's head and illuminated the surroundings. A female heavenly official who appeared like someone out of a painting appeared beside old ancestor Fan Weiran, with her appearance hazy and her lithe body enveloped in golden light. The sleeves of the seemingly intangible golden maidservant fluttered in the wind, and she reached forward to hold up an extravagant immortal canopy to shield the cultivators of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. The lake's surface under old ancestor Fan Weiran's feet had already frozen over, and it was as if she had created a temporary dock for everyone else to stand on. Yanqing breathed a sigh of relief. By the looks of it, the old ancestor wasn't planning to get involved in the conflict tonight. Lake Lord Inho remained standing in the same spot, but the two surviving river gods had already left the area with the other officials. Judging by their directions of travel, they were making their way back to their own territories. The canal master of Peony Stream felt a great sense of relief, and it appeared as if she had obtained fortune thanks to this misfortune. The delight on her face couldn't be concealed as she channeled a mystical ability and transformed into a ball of mist, rapidly making her way back to Peony Stream. Yanqing knew very clearly that Verdant Bamboo Lake was going to mobilize all its power to ruthlessly kill the young man in azure. Even so, Lake Lord Inho still had the time and the good mood to look over and smile faintly at Yanqing. Yanqing paid no heed to this. An unexpected phenomenon took place on the lake. A golden thread suddenly appeared across the misty dome that was enveloping a large area of the lake, following which the dome exploded apart like shattering ice and fused back into the lake. Chen Ping'an stood with one hand behind his back, with his other hand raised and 2 fingers held together. He was facing Lake Lord Inho with his back to the dock. The golden immortal talisman between his fingers was only less than halfway burned. Yanqing was extremely puzzled. This was nothing more than a barrier-shattering talisman? There existed such a powerful barrier-shattering talisman in the world? Not only had this person used it to shatter Lake Lord Inho's formation, but from the dock where Yanqing and Duyu were standing, they could even see him gently clenching the hand behind his back into a fist, holding onto the golden python and the turquoise snake. However, Lake Lord Inho was completely unsurprised by this turn of events, and he said with a faint smile, "This was just a small appetizer to welcome our guests from outside to Verdant Bamboo Lake. How did you find it, esteemed immortal?" Chen Ping'an looked around, and he saw that the 2 river gods and the canal master of Peony Stream had already returned to their own territories, starting to accumulate power at the origins of the rivers and canals, and allowing this power to continuously flow down to Verdant Bamboo Lake to assist Lake Lord Inho in setting up a true killing formation. If it weren't for noticing the actions of the 2 river gods and the canal master, Chen Ping'an wouldn't have minded staying in the previous formation to appreciate the bright moon and enjoy the cool night breeze. In any case, the water fortune snakes of Lake Lord Inho would be much more impressive than the measly 4 ounces of water fortune essence that the canal master of Peony Stream had given him back then once they were refined. Weighing them in his hand, Chen Ping'an estimated that each snake was at least 500 grams. Sure enough, the foundation and wealth of a lake lord were far superior to that of a measly canal master. Chen Ping'an temporarily abandoned his thoughts of refining the 2 water fortune snakes, and the 2 wisps of light in his fist instantly vanished as he forced the python and the snake outside the entrance of his water palace. Even if there were truly a hidden danger that caused his physique and soul to suffer some small consequences, Chen Ping'an was willing to accept this small price and concede that Lake Lord Inho was indeed quite capable. Inside his body and near his acupoints, 2 water element snakes were coiled up outside the water palace and trembling in terror. A fiery dragon had furiously dashed over, and it reared its head and coldly peered down at the 2 despicable snakes who were even lowlier than ants. It gently scraped its claws on the ground, and it would have smacked these 2 snakes to death without hesitation if it weren't for the familiar scent of refinement on them. The gates of the water palace instantly opened, yet they violently slammed shut just as quickly as they had opened. As it turned out, 2 little children in green had hurriedly thrown the golden python and the turquoise snake onto their shoulders before dashing back into the water palace. The gigantic body of the fiery dragon, which was the manifestation of a martial artist's true chi, slowly turned around before leaving in a leisurely manner. Lake Lord Inho spread open one hand, revealing a tiny golden shard. This was everything that the river god of the Twilight Cold River had left behind after being killed by Chen Ping'an. There had actually been a larger golden shard as well, with 2 pieces of the godly body's golden shard shooting outward following the violent death of the river god. However, the thumb-sized golden shard had been snatched by Chen Ping'an and placed inside his sleeve, and if Lake Lord Inho hadn't been quick enough, the smaller piece of golden shard would have also been snatched away by Chen Ping'an. Lake Lord Inho sighed and shook his head lightly. Even though the river god of the Twilight Cold River had been the weakest of the 3 river gods, he had been the most loyal of the 3 and had also started serving him the earliest. He had possessed both the experience of Peony Stream's canal master and the considerate nature of Algae Stream's canal master, so it was a slight shame that he had died just like that. Moreover, it was an even bigger shame that the river god had only left him such a tiny piece of golden shard. Even if Lake Lord Inho had managed to obtain the slightly larger golden shard as well, the 2 golden shards would have only been enough to advance his cultivation by roughly 100 years. Inho absorbed the tiny piece of golden shard into his palm, planning to slowly refine it following the conclusion of this important battle. In any case, this was an unexpected surprise. What did it matter that an important subordinate of his had died? He could simply ask the emperor of the Silver Screen Nation to appoint a new river god in the future. Indeed, the subordinates of this river god had already been eyeing off his position for a long time, coveting his power and influence. Otherwise, where had the additional pieces of rare treasures in his darling daughter's residence come from? During the past 100 years, the river god of the Twilight Cold River had privately kept 2 beautiful maidservants of extremely good aptitude, so if the Dragon Palace had truly wanted to target him, it could have easily punished him to death for this crime. However, the Lake Lord had chosen to spare him out of generosity, and in order to maintain the confidence and morale of his other subordinates. Chen Ping'an took a glance at the cultivators of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm standing further away now, and it was clear that they were planning to observe the conflict from the sidelines. In reality, Chen Ping'an felt slightly exasperated about this, since he would no longer be able to target them and obtain their wealth as well. Why didn't these cultivators show some chivalry and backbone, and help their ally in a time of great need? They had just been chatting and drinking at the banquet hosted by the Dragon Palace just then, yet they were going to coldly turn their back on the Lake Lord now? Would it be a big ask for them to casually activate a few immortal treasures to attack him and gauge his strength? In any case, Chen Ping'an wasn't planning on becoming too hostile with these cultivators from the Treasure Basin Immortal sect. However, Verdant Bamboo Lake was different. Gods of the mountains and rivers performing evil deeds and terrorizing a region was completely different from cultivators committing sins and having complete disregard for the mortal world. Seeing no further movement from Chen Ping'an, Lake Lord Inho asked, "Perhaps you want to resolve the matter peacefully now?" "I'm simply waiting for the main dish to be served," Chen Ping'an replied. "Excellent. Very well. What frankness and honesty!" Lake Lord Inho exclaimed with hearty laughter. Chen Ping'an narrowed his eyes. The Lake Lord had overseen the water fortune of Verdant Bamboo Lake for 1,000 years, ruling over an area which was as large as the territories of some small vassal states. He had presumably treated the mortal world as his plaything all these years, right? After becoming a spirit, being appointed a formal god, and obtaining the power of a deity, had the Lake Lord never been forced to shed tears before? There was not a single ripple on the surface of the river. However, an azure figure instantly appeared in front of Lake Lord Inho. The Lake Lord, who was dressed in an extravagant reddish-purple dragon robe, hesitated for a moment before deciding against dodging. Instead, he planned to test the fists of this so-called sword immortal standing in front of him. He raised a hand to block Chen Ping'an's strike. The reddish-purple dragon robe was a Dao robe that Lake Lord Inho had spent a huge sum of immortal coins to meticulously refine, and it was a genuine immortal treasure that could be regarded as a valuable treasure even in immortal forces such as Yellow Axe City and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. When it came to the foundation and wealth of immortal forces, this was largely determined by how many immortal treasures an immortal force possessed. When it came to formal gods of mountains and rivers, however, their foundation and wealth were determined by how many godly positions they could freely manipulate and give to their trusted subordinates. Such great power. A flood dragon swimming along the surface of the reddish-purple Dao robe surprisingly exploded straight away. Lake Lord Inho borrowed the momentum to slide back a dozen or so meters. Perhaps this young man in azure was a martial arts superior grandmaster at the Vajrabadi tier? Perhaps his identity as a so-called sword immortal was nothing more than an act of purposeful deception that he had set up at the Water Immortal Shrine? However, Lake Lord Inho remained unfazed as he raised his hand and blocked another punch. 2 of the Water Fortune flood dragons on his dragon robe exploded this time. But what exactly was a Dao robe? Lake Lord Inho was able to freely condense and disperse the flood dragon formed from spiritual energy on his reddish-purple Dao robe, and he could quickly recreate them even if 1 or 2 were temporarily destroyed by his opponent's attacks. This was similar to how deities could instantly restore their godly bodies as long as the foundations of their great Dao weren't severely damaged. As such, Lake Lord Inho was confident that he could withstand several hundred punches from the young man in azure if the 2 punches just then were anything to go by. At that time, it would be a contest between whether his Dao robe was more capable, or whether his opponent's breath of true qi was longer lasting. The 3rd punch quickly arrived. Two flood dragons swimming across the large sleeves of the Dao robe were instantly blasted into smithereens. Lake Lord Yin Ho's expression started to become serious. He was just about to contemplate whether or not he should channel his mystical ability to break free from these attacks, since it was completely unnecessary for him, a deity who was as noble as the rulers of mortal nations, to personally engage in battle and endanger himself. This was especially the case since the power of the two rivers and one canal had already been gathered, with the three deities imminently about to surge into verdant bamboo lake with their accumulated power. If Lake Lord Yin Ho hadn't wanted to flaunt his might and power as a Lake Lord in front of celestial maiden Yanqing, would it have been possible for this young man in azure to set foot on verdant bamboo lake and arrive before him? Doing so would have been more difficult than ascending the heavens. Lake Lord Yin Ho was hovering several meters above the surface of the lake, and after being pushed back by another punch, he silently placed one foot on the lake and smiled faintly in a mocking manner. However, another punch immediately arrived. Something that appeared like an ice statue of the Lake Lord instantly shattered into countless pieces. Lake Lord Yin Ho stood far away in the water several meters below the surface, clasping his hands behind his back and shaking his wrists to loosen his muscles. Sure enough, this young man in azure was a pure martial artist. It was no wonder that he dared to recklessly kill the canal master and the river god. A heavy blow suddenly struck the Lake Lord in the back, with the fist aura soaring upward and directly blasting the Lake Lord out of the water and into the sky. Thankfully, only 6 flood dragons swimming across the reddish-purple Dao robe were shattered as a result. Otherwise, the Dao robe would have temporarily lost its power if all 9 flood dragons were shattered at once. In this sense, the Lake Lord's Dao robe worked in a similar way to the divine dew-bearing armors formed from militarian armor pellets. Another punch crashed down from overhead. There was a loud clang in the sky, and it was as if someone had struck a huge bell. Lake Lord Yin Ho had just been launched out of verdant bamboo lake a moment ago, yet he was immediately sent crashing back into the lake the very next instant. Even though Lake Lord Yin Ho was barely injured by these attacks, he felt like facing these 2 punches was truly the most humiliating moment in his life.